The Russian accusations are absurd. They're laughable. And, in the words of my Irish Catholic grandfather, a bunch of malarkey. There's nothing to it. It's classic Russian propaganda. And I wouldn't, if I were you, I wouldn't give it a drop of ink worth paying attention to.
Yeah, but can you explain to us has there been any relationship between the?
We are not developing biological or chemical weapons inside Ukraine. It's not happening.
They have a large biological and chemical weapons program. So it's a pattern, but they also have the capacity. Well, I'm not going to get into specific intelligence. We look at all of those factors. And we also know, and one of the main issue that prompted my Twitter thread yesterday was that Russia has a history also of inventing outright lies like this, which is the suggestion that the United States has a chemical and biological weapons program, or Ukraine does, that they're operating. Russia is the country that has a chemical and biological weapons program. So the objective was to make clear the inaccuracy of the information, the misinformation they're trying to put out, and make clear to the world that they not only have the capacity, they have a history of using chemical and biological weapons, and that in this moment we should have our eyes open for that possibility.
Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me today. I kind of mucked up this show a bit, and I'll explain it later, but I'll give you an overview of today's show. I tried something new, and probably wasn't the time to try something new. So what's today's show going to be about? Well, back in the early coronavirus, don't forget, corona means heart, all these heart attacks people are having. Early in coronavirus time, people were all yapping about BIOLABS and Fort Detrick. It was all over the news saying, oh, the lab leak came from Wuhan. So there was a lot of pinpointing back and forth. People were saying, well, it came from Wuhan. Well, maybe it came from Fort Detrick. Well, supposedly in the 60s, the U.S. stopped doing biolabs. Ha, ha, ha. But they could also fund biolabs around the world, right? See how that works? Besides, what do we think they're doing in all those secret military bases? Biolabs. Keep in mind, they actually sit around and cook up these horrors to do to us. They are, in fact, sadist. And I'll explain why later. So during that time, they were talking about going back and forth, and then finally Wuhan got mad and kicked back sometime around 2020, as I recall, and put the blame back on Fort Detrick. Well, who was blaming who? I would have to say that Wuhan and the United States are quite friendly, because right before World War II, Wuhan let the United States firebomb their city because Curtis LeMay, right before the United States firebombed Japan and said it was nuclear, well, they did a test run on the B-29 and the bombs they were planning on dropping on Japan. So the U.S. firebombed Japan right before World War II. So it sounds to me like they're pretty comfortable with each other. And right prior to this, I put the link down below, in 2019 in China, they had a huge military games march. All of them were there. Fort Detrick was there. All of the U.S. people were there. People were there from around the world. It was a big production. Take a look at it for yourself. That production was years in the making. So there they are, dancing around in Wuhan around November of 2019. Everything's going fine, right? Then supposedly the breakout in early 2020, and then they start pointing fingers back and forth. So that brought up a lot of talk about all of these biolabs. And I had thought that the biolab that got started here after World War II, Fort Detrick, was the only one, but thinking is not research. So I took a closer look. As you go through the show today, one character, one main Nazi will keep appearing, a person named Eric Traub, Traub. I found an interesting article about Eric Traub called The Sleeper Agent. Traub had quite a history, and I can show you today the facts about how Traub was brought over to this country. And he was involved in all of the biolabs. There's one biolab that was the first one in Germany, surprise, surprise. Then there's Fort Detrick. And a couple of years after Fort Detrick, they set up another biolab called Plum Island. Plum Island had completely skipped past my radar. Then I was looking around. I found this German village for some strange reason on Long Island. There was a German village. Yeah, they had an actual German village there. So I was having some trouble connecting this German village with what was going on. Well, then I started looking around at Plum Island, which is a biolab. Well, Plum Island is right off of Long Island. The German village was on Long Island. So the people who were working on Plum Island also hung around this German village because the U.S., in fact, brought over Nazis to work on this. And one particular Nazi, that Trow person, I will show you today, he worked at the lab in Germany. That lab started around 1910. He worked at Fort Detrick, and he also, bing, 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 worked at Plum Island. So how did I even get Plum Island? Well, it wasn't even anything I was thinking about. If you remember during the Franklin case, and I did a show about this, there was one MK7 slave person named Randy Turner. Randy Turner claimed that he murdered William Colby, the U.S. CIA agent, William Colby. So in some roundabout way, I ran across Randy Turner online, and he claimed that he had murdered Colby. So he said something about Plum Island. So a month or two ago, I said, well, what's Plum Island? Well, quite a place, as it turns out. What happened was in 1936, it was called German American Bund, B-U-N-D, a pro-Nazi groups, was formed in the United States to advocate the policies beneficial to Germany. The Bund was very active throughout the later half of the 1930s, organizing rallies and marches, including a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939. I'll be playing a clip about that for a little bit more. So yeah, right there, right across from Plum Island. So what exactly did Randy Turner said? This is exactly what he said. He said, William Colby wasn't just involved in experimenting on teenagers at Plum Island. I'm pretty sure he was also a serial killer. To all these people wondering if Colby was killed, yes, I am the one who killed. This is him talking, not me. Yes, I am the one who killed him for what he did to me and the others on Plum Island. So that's where I got the idea for Plum Island. But first, for some odd reason, I had run across that German camp over there on Long Island. So then I eventually hooked them together in my head, right? Basically, this is about them cooking up diseases, then coming up with a cure because they invent things that may impact us in the future. It's a very thoughtful marketing plan, in case you ever decide to start wandering around and you get bit by a bat or something. Well, they'll have the cure in the form of a vaccine. And I'll talk in this show about, I think 100% these scientists are also sadist, but that will come later. So first, let's talk about this Traub character. From 1942 to 1948, Traub worked as the lab chief at the Reich Research Institute for Viral Diseases for Animals. It's on a place called Riems, Riems Island. So they have their island set up over there in Germany. It's a German animal virus research institute in the Baltic Sea, now named the Friedrich Locher Institute. The institute was headed by Professor Dr. Otto Waldman from 1919 to 1948, while Traub was the vice president. The institute at Riems Island was a dual-use facility during the Second World War, where at least some biological warfare experiments were conducted. It had been founded in around 1909 to 1910 to study foot and mouth disease in animals. And by World War II, it employed about 20 scientists and a staff of 70 to 120 people. There was this person named Hans Christopher Nagel, a veterinarian and biological warfare expert for the German army, conducted experiments there, as did Traub. So Erich Traub, born June 1906, died May 18th, 1985. It's hard not to start cheering. Hey, he's dead. Yay. I'm just kidding. I don't want to turn out like one of them, so I won't cheer because he's dead, but I am laughing. So maybe I'll get struck dead for laughing because he's dead, right? Okay, he was a German veterinarian, scientist, and virologist who specialized in foot and mouth disease, rinderpest, and Newcastle disease. Traub was a member of the National Socialist Motor Corps, a Nazi motorist corps from 1938 to 1942. He worked directly for Heinrich Himmler. Da, da, da. Do you hear me snapping my boot together? Heinrich Himmler was his boss. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the Schutzstaben, SS, as the lab chief of the Nazis' leading bioweapons facility on Riems Island. So Erich Traub worked directly for Himmler, who was the head of the SS. I'm pretty sure that Erich Traub comes from some elite family because all of these tremendously, well, in my opinion, sick people come from money, right? Our CIA was founded by people who all came from money. The OSS, they put themselves in charge. The money people are in charge. So these rich people and their kids are the ones cooking up this horror show. It's just kind of a different way to do eugenics on us, right? They can't really just pull up on your street and start mowing down you and all your neighbors. So instead, they just schedule lab experiments and stuff, right? To kill us that way. Now, actually, driving up on my block and mowing everybody down would be a more humane way to kill the rest of us, right? So that's where the sadism comes in, because they actually want to haul us off to labs, do horrible tests, cut off your arm and try to reapply it as your leg, this kind of horrible stuff. I believe these people's minds are polluted, and I also believe a lot of them take Adderall, cocaine, and drugs in that family that gives them that delusional thinking. So anyway, so our guy Traub here, he was originally transported from the Soviet zone of Germany after World War II. So Traub ended up in the Soviet zone of Germany during World War II, but they took him out of that area. So we really should start to ask, I wonder what was going on in that Soviet zone of Germany, right, during World War II. But anyway, so this is where Traub came from. And he was taken to the United States. So clearly, if he was transported from the Soviet zone of Germany, that would be East Germany, right? That would lead me to believe that while they had East Germany closed up, probably lots of human experiments started to go on, right? So then he was taken. So the Soviets supposedly said, "Hey, Traub's our guy." And he said, "No, I want to go to the United States." I should have practiced my German accent, but I did. So anyway, so they picked up Traub in the Soviet zone of Germany. They took him to the United States in 1949 under the auspices of the United States government program Operation Paperclip, meant to exploit the post-war scientific knowledge in Germany and deny it to the Soviet Union. But this is where it gets interesting about Traub. The clip that I'll be playing later, he talks about Traub, but not in this kind of detail. Here's where it gets interesting. During the 1930s, Traub studied on a fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in Princeton, New Jersey, and was mentored by a man named Richard Shope. I looked up Richard Shope pretty well. Yeah, he was the one who was involved in the 1918 Spanish flu. Yeah, they're all, well, I don't think I need to say much more. So he studied at Rockefeller Institute. He mentored under this guy, Richard Shope, performing research on vaccines and viruses, including these different viruses, lymphomatic chloromongenitis virus. During his stay in the United States, Traub and his wife were listed as members of the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi German-American club 30 miles west of Plum Island in Yaphank, Long Island, from 1934 to 1935. So now we have Traub. I mean, really, come on. The guy has USA written all over him, right? He studies at Rockefeller. He's hanging around the German village at 34, 35 before the war is even really going. Traub worked at the University of Gießen in Germany from 1938 to 42. Traub was a member of the Nazi NSKK, a motorist corps from 1938 to 1942. The NSKK was declared a condemned, not a criminal organization at the Nuremberg trials. Dr. Traub's World War II handiwork consisted of aerial virus sprays developed on incel Riems. So right out there at that German bio place, he's over there developing things that they're spraying on Russians. So he developed aerial virus sprays developed on Riems, and they tested over occupied Russia, and a field work for Heinrich Himmler in Turkey. His colleagues collected bug trials by dropping live beetles from planes. An outdoor tick trial had been a rue de jour for Traub. Yeah, ticks will come up later on Plum Island. Ticks and Lyme disease. After noting that allegations of the discovery of BB, which is a bacteria that causes Lyme disease, in the late 1940s, that also coincided with Traub's arrival on the island. They've been trying to say that Traub really wasn't there, but I found a lot of really hardworking people over in the blog world, and they have documented all these things about Traub being around all these facilities. So, so they said that in the late 40s, Traub arrived on the island, and so the same thing in that Frederick Lohler Institute on the island of Rheims can only be reached via a single bridge. And what's interesting about that German Bund deal that they had set up, remember during Chile, after World War II, they set up torture camps in Chile. And I have a show about it. Just look for Chile in the title. But anyways, after World War II, they set up torture camps in Chile. And then when they got caught doing that, what they did was they put a German festival over it. So tourists can now go to that site where they were doing all these horrible experiments. And it's a German, German, you can buy steins of German beer and stuff. So I just found it interesting. That's why I originally started looking at that German place on Long Island, wondering, what is this, right? But anyway, so they did the same thing. They set up a German thing in Chile when they had to close down that experiment place. So just a little, I love odd details if you haven't noticed. So, okay, the island lies in the Baltic Sea and its isolated location is vital. Dangerous viruses are stored there, including Ebola, rabies, swine fever, Crimean Congo fever, and SARS-CoV-2. The facility is one of only 3 such laboratories in the world and the only one in Europe, where dangerous diseases can be researched using live animals such as cattle and pigs under high security conditions. Researchers are working to understand how new pathogens spread. And I just had this horrible thought. Oh, normally I put the recording on so I can see it going, and I just didn't do that one step. That's what's going on with this radiation. I didn't do this one step, so I missed it. Okay, let me fix this real quick. Okay. Yeah, radiation is interesting stuff. I pity the people who don't know they're getting radiated because you probably start thinking you're getting some dementia or something because it attacks your brain in very specific way. Okay, so back to this. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, so the place over on Rhyme certainly has some interesting things there. Think of all the years they got us giving our dogs rabies vaccines and stuff and killing our pets off, but can't go there today. You know, obviously rabies is not real. These people created it, so that's why they make our dogs get injections. But anyway, so the Frederick Lockham Institute, or FLI, is the Federal Institute for Animal Health of Germany, that country's leading animal disease center. The institute was founded in 1910 and named for its founder, Frederick Locher, in 1952. The FLI is situated on the Isle of Riems, which belongs to the city of Greifswald. Then we have Fort Detrick. Remember Fort Detrick? I did a show about this. Fort Detrick was the center of the U.S. biological weapons program from 1943 to 1969. Since the discontinuation of that program, it has hosted well, it says it's been discontinued, but, well, what gets discontinued is they come up with grants. So all of these colleges, all of these countries all over the world, they can set up their own biolabs. Isn't that great? And the U.S. will send them money to do that. So yes, maybe technically they're not doing biolab work in this country. Maybe technically. But then what do we know that's going on in all those military bases, right? They can say a lot of things, but then they can say, well, we're so worried about these people out there to get us. These people really sound also paranoid, right? Like everybody is out to get them. That is exactly what meth, speed, and coke and all those things do to people. These people are drug users and deviant. So anyway, so Plum Island is an island in the town of Southold in Suffolk County, New York. And here's where it gets interesting because I think this is all, they pick these locations based on something. Is it their astrology, the longitude, latitude? I don't really know. But for example, I've talked in the past, those pilgrims started with Coven in Norfolk, UK. Then we have Norfolk, Virginia, where the CIA and all those people are located. And I'm living in Norfolk, Nebraska, in a major coven here. So there's something about the connection between these names, and probably has to do with the numbers or the location, because this is what I found really, really fascinating. So the island is situated in Gardier's Bay, east of Orient Point, off the eastern end of the North Fork coast of Long Island. Okay, let me repeat that. It is east of Orient Point. It is off the eastern end of the North Fork coast of Long Island. Norfolk, the word Norfolk also means North Fork, which is interesting because why is Plum Island off of the North Fork coast of Long Island? Norfolk, a region of eastern England bordering on the North Sea, historically part of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of East Anglia. Its name means the northern people, as opposed to the southern people of Suffolk. An independent city of Southeast Virginia on Hamptons Road, southeast of Richmond. Founded in 1682, and it has been a major naval base since the American Revolution. So why North Fork? Who are these northern people, right? Probably something there, but I'm just going to keep moving along for right now, because this is all connected by their mad little ways with all this astrology and this magic and all this stuff. So let me keep going so I can close off this section. Although the Plum Island facility and its 400-person workforce had been an important part of the nation's defenses against animal diseases for decades, it's scheduled to shut down by approximately 2023. And what I did was I looked into it, and it's moving to Kansas. Because Operation Paperclip, the secret program of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, in which about 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were given asylum in the United States between 1945 and 1959. In Plum Island, and as well as Nassau, you could go into a conference room and scream, "Heil Hitler!" and marvel at how many hands instinctively went up. So where are they moving this place to? I don't believe it's open yet, but its location is in Manhattan, Kansas, which is good. Let's put it right in the middle of farm country. Put all these viruses. The largest concentration of animal health companies in the world are located in Manhattan, Kansas. Never knew this. It is constructed and operated on a secure, federally owned site adjacent to Kansas State University's Biosecurity Research Institute and the Kansas Department of Agriculture. So in closing off, if you're in Kansas and you're near this site, you might learn a little bit from the people at Fort Detrick. Dangerous chemical weapons buried at Fort Detrick's military base have infiltrated the ground and have claimed the lives of more than 2,500 people, well, that they know of, in nearby communities. In one family alone, 11 people were diagnosed with cancer. Gee, so much for living near Fort Detrick, right? And 57 people living on the same street were diagnosed with cancer. And the beat goes on, right? Don't forget, the United States does not pay settlements. They did pay one for the Marshall Islands people. What happened to that? Well, that money got stolen under Trump. This is all about no consent. It's about lies. It's about deception. And most of all, it's about eugenics. Today's show, I've added sadism to the topic. I've had all this information weeks ago. And when I added this sadism part, I hesitated. And I really thought about doing it in a show on its own. But this entire thing is about sadism, right? And in fact, they are sadomasochistic themselves. And that is what my work is all about. Defining who are these psychopaths that are running things. I have to tell you, I only added the sadism part in the last day or two. I am still a bit stunned about it. I don't really stun that easily. I believe this sadism deal and this Marquis de Sade, the person who cooked all this up, I believe that is their script, a very disturbing script about how the wealthy and their children also grow into monsters by their own psychopathic treatments. That who is running the world. So our main group of people, the 1%, the people who called themselves the royalty, the people who got us to work for them for labor, otherwise they would not have what they have. They are so lazy and entitled that their children have grown into the same monsters that the parents have, doing things, and then they've created gang stalking out of local churches for the rest of us. We are, in fact, surrounded by these people, the monsters around us, these sadists. This sadist person, this Marquis de Sade, S-A-D-E, wrote this very disturbing thing, 120 Days of Sodom. It is about a wealthy group of powerful, they're called them libertines. They kidnap 18 innocent young people and subject them to horrific tortures and humiliations over the course of 4 months. That, to me, and you'll have to decide for yourself because I'll be playing a clip about it later. That, to me, sounds like the roadmap that we're on right now. Just like that Bible is what is going on. They wrote that Bible and that became their roadmap. So now with all of these bugs that are unleashing and no food, they can say, oh, famines. We've always had famines. Look at the Bible. When in reality, I'm here to say they've only been doing this for the last couple hundred years. And have they ever been doing it in a very robust way, right? Right there in front of us. They have convinced people that they're doing these things to help us out. Why do I always say evil has to come packaged as help? So, something kind of interesting that I just ran across randomly that I'll share with you. I ran across this article that said, why are these 80 scientists now dead? Why are they all microbiologists? Microbiologists are involved in formulating vaccines and determining the optimal composition and dosage to elicit a robust immune system. I have that article down below. Pretty interesting question, right? Well, I believe they kill their own people. I mean, they're killing me. They murder anybody in their path because they're psychopaths and they get a very sick joy out of all of this. So I certainly hope you'll stay to the end of the show because, you know, those power plants that are just sitting around innocently, well, they have a trick that is so explosive. Those power plants are going to go kaboom, kaboom, big time. You need to know where these things are. Do you know where the power plants are in your area? Do you know where any dams are? Do you know where your smart meter is? Do you know where those transformers are? So I hope the show today makes sense. The radiation is now getting to my brain. The summer is much harder. something about being in the hot air and the radiation don't mix. So I've been kind of struggling. So I hope that you're taking all this seriously. Be ready to not use your heater if you want to also slow it all down coming this winter. I'm 73 years old now. I have gone without heat the last couple of winters and I survived. Make it your mission. The more that spews into your house, the more you have invited the eugenics into your own property. So I'm going to play these clips now. Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. Got a big one for you. It's going to go on for a while. We're going to be talking about sadism. Yeah, we can clearly say now that a key element with psychopaths is, in fact, sadism. And I'll be discussing that in detail today. Psychopaths, along with narcissism, their high-risk behavior, drugs and alcohol. I mean, think no further than like things like, oh, I don't know, the stock market, things that escalate, go up and down. They're very attached to all of those things. And we can easily see certain things. All the early people, like the OSS, which was prior to the CIA, all of those people in those top positions came from key backgrounds, money. In the early days, they came from royalty. For example, this character Ishii from Japan, the one who did the horrible human experiments in that I think it was 731. The Japanese, yeah, Ishii came from a royal family. So it appears to me, let's say in theory, this is a game board. We came from an advanced society. We're down here tooling along, learning how to survive, make our own food. All of these things would be challenges for us, right? Because we had everything we needed where we came from. So this earth is like it's like a cheap version of the Matrix, okay? So while we're here chewing along, these people come along and grab the power. I think they did it first by dressing themselves up as royal people, dressing themselves up as military leaders and priests. They wrote that Bible, and this has all been scripted by books, movies, and things like that. But since all of the early people with the CIA, the ones doing all of that horrible stuff with the banana wars and all of that, those people all came from money. So I think I can clearly say that these psychopaths in charge have a strong sadism in their behavior. So they took over first ruling countries as royalty, right? They put on those royal clothes and they put on those military regalia with all the awards and things pinned to their chest. They never were any of those things. They only got the money they have from the labor of the rest of us. What they did was they put themselves in a position to control and manipulate the rest of us so they would have also control of all of the money. They basically have a history of never working. Their whole role is to manipulate and control, and most times using horrifically cruel methods. They just have changed methods over time. So in looking at all of this, what I've come to the conclusion is this. I was talking about Fort Detrick being things like the first place that they were doing BIOLABS and things like that. And Fort Detrick started after the war. Well, actually, it started before. There was a biolab in Germany around the 1910 time frame. So I think what happened was this. They already had that biolab going in Germany around 1910. Then they have World War II going on. Those concentration camps were like open biolabs, right? With human experiments. Then after the war, people thought, wow, glad that's over. No more experiments. Well, no, not really, because what happened was those experiments moved to the United States and then around the world, all hiding in plain sight on U.S. military bases. All those bases also expanded right after that. And then there's some patterns because I did a show about Chile. You'll find Chile in the title. Lots of torture went on in Chile right after World War II. And the funny thing was, not funny, ha ha, but the interesting thing was that when they had to shut down what was going on in Chile with the human experiments, they set up like this German village. Yeah, seriously, this German tourist place right on the site where all this terrific stuff had been going on. So, so then the interesting thing is I'm looking at these biolabs, right? Okay, so first we have Germany, 1910 time frame. Then we have Fort Detrick. Well, then they have the war, right? World War II, where they're actually doing the biolab stuff in those concentration camps. And then we had Fort Detrick, is where the paperclip people came from, right? And then at the same time, they like to do dual operations. So they like to do dual operations, right? So another biolab got started about 2 years after Fort Detrick, a place called Plum Island. Had no clue about Plum Island. So yeah, so that was the progression, right? Plum Island is actually where Lyme disease came from. So, this whole concept, the way they sold this thing was, well, these biolabs, I mean, to them, they're good for, let's say sometime in the future, one of us gets bit by a bat or something like that. Well, they've already experimented on bats and done all this stuff and come up with some vaccine. So the whole premise, in my mind, starts off rather insane to begin with, right? Because that's to suppose that in the future we're going to have lost our minds and be running through bat caves and running the risk of getting bit by bats. Well, bats hide in caves to avoid us, so I don't think bats are ever going to become some sort of human attack animal. So I don't see any real reason to hunt down bats in caves. But along with this, today I'll be exploring the idea of sadism. So I've talked in the past about, what kind of scientist, goes into this job. And part of your job is going into work every day, and there's dogs or cats or bats or monkeys or things locked up in cages. So every day you go in and look at them and you prod them, you prod them, you give them drugs, you watch them die, slow deaths. I mean, it takes, and this is just, I'm just telling you where I am with all of this. So hopefully we can gather together and think a little bit more about who really are these people in charge, right? So if you're the scientist that goes in and does this work with these animals in cages and stuff, I think it takes a certain kind of sadistic personality. Now, you might have your Uncle Charlie. You think, yeah, my Uncle Charlie, the nicest guy on the planet, he would never participate. I'm not saying that every scientist is a sadist, but just hear me out. I think that there's sadism. If you're a psychopath, you're likely going to be sadistic. And because we know that these people now have had their brains split through all this mind altering MK7 ceremonial stuff, they're doing it at the castle and different places like that around Belgium and stuff. We know that the elites are all doing this process on themselves and their own children. We know people around us are doing it in these churches and stuff. So already the reason we want to talk about sadism along with this is there's a lot of people in the population around us who, through this mind splitting, this abandonment, all of these issues, there's a lot of sadism involved. Just because we wouldn't do something to somebody else doesn't mean that a sadist and a psychopath lacks that ability. Because if you're a sadist or a psychopath, you lack having a conscience, those human emotions that come along with, well, not having been tortured as a child and all of that. So anyway, so this is the ideal thing because, they start off in Germany with the concentration camps and pretty much in the open, right? I mean, when they supposedly freed up those people in those camps and stuff, there were a lot of suspicious things about how those people were freed, the delays and all that stuff. One thing that I've been thinking about is maybe maybe during that era of the game board, maybe the Jews were the ones who had all the money, right? They had most of the investment. So that would be another big aspect of that war would be to use their competition as part of the human experiment. See how that went? Because they certainly spent a great deal of effort loading up trains and shipping them all of these people's merchandises and homes and gold, all the loot that they stole all over Europe, claiming it was because they were Jews. Was the war staged to do this human experiments and to loot who they saw as a competition, these Jews? And then they were able to kind of double as those Jews to get themselves into Palestine. Well, evil always has to come packaged as help, right? When these people offer to help, they're up to something, right? So why did we even accept this idea that they were running around and torturing bats and stuff to then come up with diseases? So in the future they'd have this ready. Well, it's the best thing that they could come up with because this is about eugenics. How often do they talk about the United States as an experiment? So these wars and these other things are just cover stories for this, right? Because I feel like they're really doing these BIOLABS with all the bugs they're releasing and all these things. Just another way to use another kill box, right? Same way they use wars to kill large groups of men. These efforts they're doing in these BIOLABS are the same. I do not feel like it matters to them for a second when things get loose from those labs. What bothers them is if they get caught and somebody pins the blame on them for these things getting loose. So I found it really interesting that I was reading along and I found that there was a German village here in the United States in the Long Island area. Well, then I don't know, for some reason I was cruising around and I found that this Plum Island was going on. Plum Island was a biolab that got started about 2 years after Fort Detrick. Well, I about fell off my chair when I saw that the people that set up the biolab in uh, Plum Island, the closest place you could live off of Plum Island, because people didn't live on Plum Island doing these experiments, they lived on Long Island. See, right there on Long Island, they have this German village, where actually right here in the United States was this German village. So before I play this clip, let's look at the term sadomasochism. That refers to deriving pleasure, often of a sexual nature, from the infliction of physical or psychological pain on another person or oneself. I believe that they they derive this sadomasochism. They derive this pleasure, and it is of a sexual nature. The term is a combination of sadism, which is pleasure from inflicting the pain, and masochism, which is pleasure from receiving the pain. So I think they're both, but before we get going here, I'm going to put this on hold because I'm going to play this clip because luckily I found some really good clips that I'll be interspersing here. This first clip is going to play and speak about the German village right there on Long Island. So yeah, I was pretty surprised because I don't know, somehow I ran across this German village at some point when I was just nosing around. And then when I started looking into Plum Island, and I'll get to that more later, but when I started looking into Plum Island, and then when I realized that the people working on Plum Island lived on Long Island, I thought, what the heck? So yes, because they brought over Nazis under paperclip, right? And they claimed that paperclip was for the space industry. Well, we all know now the space industry is fake, right? So most of those people from World War II got dispersed between Fort Detrick and Plum Island. But the group on Plum Island actually hung around this German village. So let me play that clip here.
In this tiny, quiet enclave off Mill Road in Yaphank, the field that was once the center of a popular summer camp here betrays, at first glance, little of the history of what went on here from the mid-1930s to the early 40s.
Vern, what is this? This is the entrance to Camp Siegfried.
Camp Siegfried, operated by the pro-Nazi group German-American Bund in the lead-up to World War II, attracted thousands of young New York area campers to experience the great outdoors, group athletics, and goose stepping.
Right beyond that White House that you can see just through the trees is where the central plaza was, where marching took place, where festivities took place, where all sorts of, it was really the center of the camp.
Nazi rallies.
Nazi rallies, right.
Vern Gay, Newsday's veteran television industry writer, reports the camp instilled Nazi ideology in the minds of young campers.
Their worldview, which was indoctrinated into these kids, was that the Jews had been taking over the world and it was time to get rid of them and to move the pure Aryan race in.
I hope to shine a light on a sort of terrifying and chilling piece of history that I didn't know about.
Bess Wohl has written a play set at Camp Siegfried that opened off-Broadway this month.
I think it's really important to think about how people get indoctrinated into fascism and extreme movements, and hopefully to use the stories from our past to help us avoid making those same mistakes again.
Vern, Park Boulevard here. What did that street used to be called?
Hitlerstrasse.
Hitler Street.
Hitler Street.
Reminders of a mostly buried past resurfaced from time to time in a neighborhood that would prefer to put Camp Siegfried behind it.
It kind of flares up every now and then where someone will buy a property and an old record will surface and it will say Adolf Hitler Street.
At the Longwood Public Library, local history librarian and archivist Melanie Cardone Leathers has documented the story of Camp Siegfried for more than a decade.
If you look very closely at their uniforms, you see these little flashes of light of the SS symbol. So they are actually wearing a version of the Nazi youth outfit.
These were American children, not Germans, who traveled by the thousands to Yaphank, mostly from the city.
There was a special train from Penn Station.
What do you mean?
Camp Siegfried Express. It would leave Penn Station and around 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, depending on the time of year. And it'd have about 12 to 14 cars full of people. Nazi flags would be on display. People would be wearing uniforms.
The German-American Settlement League, which took over what was Camp Siegfried,
required that all residents here be of German extraction, up until just a few years ago.
They had still racial covenants in place.
A 2017 settlement between neighborhood officials and the New York State Attorney General ended the German descent requirement and forced the group to reform its policies and operations. But to this day, the sign at the entrance to the neighborhood does not encourage the presence of outsiders. Steve Langford for Newsday TV.
Yeah, pretty interesting how they had their own village. Yeah, there's a whole lot to all that if you want to explore it later. So anyhow, so remember, they started with the pornography, and the closest one I found was starting in 1524 when they had something called I Modi. And that was called the 16 Pleasures, okay? And that was an illustrated sex guide published in Italy. And what they did was they did these paintings. Well, anyway, so they've had to teach themselves about sex and stuff because of generationally who they are, right? So I've been saying for years they absolutely do not understand who we are. So I think they would have taken over around 1700 time frame, give or take 100 years or so. So they start off with this I Modi, which is supposedly the 16 pleasures, which illustrates the sexual guide, 1524. Supposedly banned by the Catholic Church, right? So then the next real important thing happened with this person called Marquis de Sade, with a very suspicious sounding book called The 120 Days of Sodom. It was a highly controversial and disturbing novel that delves into the darkest aspects of human nature. See, this is another thing. They always try to phrase these things. Human nature. Yeah, everybody does it. Yeah, we're all kind of psychopaths. So they always do this kind of inclusive language, which I advise you to do not become a part of it. Let that be your radar alert, right? Because they always want to say, oh yeah, we're all this way. So, okay, so the book, 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade, delving into the darkest aspects of human nature. The book is set in a remote castle where 4 wealthy libertines engage in extreme acts of debauchery and sadism over the course of 120 days. See, I think that things like the Bible and them, they wrote the Bible and that was their first script, the best script they wrote, right? Because out of the Bible came all these books, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, all of this stuff. So, and if you like the Bible, that's entirely up to you. I don't happen to believe that the Bible is true. I think the first thing they did was they wrote that Bible and started defining things, right? Because they wanted to get us into the rest of these definitions. So the novel is known for its graphic and explicit content, including themes of sexual violence, torture, and psychological abuse. It is not for the faint of heart and has been described as both grotesque and revolting. The characters, including an aristocrat, a bishop, a banker, and a judge, are portrayed as the epitome of evil, engaging in heinous acts with their victims. Despite its shocking content, some readers find the book to be a profound exploration of the depths of human depravity and the nature of evil. Well, they say that overall it's a polarizing work. Well, yes, it is. I keep wanting to say that, remember, they're people and they're the depraved ones who actually cook up this stuff, right? Because right there in the same time frame talking about all this depravity and stuff, this Marquis de Sade wrote this in 1785. And it was published again in 1904 when the manuscript was rediscovered. Now, wasn't that handy? So 1785 was when it was written. Gee, right about the time they're setting up the rules, right? Then, oh yeah, it kind of fell out of favor. And right before Weimar and all these places, they find the manuscript. Oh, isn't that interesting? So I'm going to be playing 2 clips here. The first one is a 3-minute explanation of a sadistic personality. I'd like you to pay attention to this. A lot of this stuff is about omission, what they leave out of the picture. That's where they need all those attorneys. They always do carve-outs, things that they don't include, the trick parts, right? So you'll notice this explanation, they're calling it sadistic personality disorder. And you'll notice that, oh, gee, they don't seem to know much about it. Just like, oh, gee, they didn't know much about psychopaths, right? So they brought in Cleckley. Cleckley was also a sadist. He put people into comas and stuff. These people have a strong leaning toward sadism. So why do they seem to be so vague about what is sadism? Well, you'll have to pay attention for yourself, because when I come back, I'll be talking about some of these characters that star in this stuff, and they certainly seem sadistic to me. So hang on there. We'll play those clips now.
Notice, the images of individuals appearing in this video serve solely for illustrative purposes. They may not represent actual doctors or patients. Thank you. Sadistic personality disorder, SPD, is a psychiatric condition characterized by a pattern of cruel, demeaning, and aggressive behavior. This disorder, which is often controversial and complex in its diagnosis and understanding, has been a subject of extensive debate among mental health professionals. Although it was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-3R, it was later removed and is not currently recognized as a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5, the standard classification of mental disorders used by mental health professionals in the United States. The core feature of sadistic personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of sadistic behavior, meaning that an individual derives pleasure from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation on others. This pleasure is not solely sexual. Rather, it can manifest in various forms such as emotional, psychological, or physical abuse. Individuals with SPD often have a preoccupation with power and control, and their sadistic actions are a means to exert this control over others. The origins and development of SPD are not entirely understood, but several theories have been proposed. These include childhood abuse or trauma, brain abnormalities, and learned behavior. Some experts suggest that individuals with SPD may have experienced a history of being controlled or humiliated themselves, leading them to seek power over others as a means of coping. However, these theories are speculative, and more research is needed to understand the disorder's etiology fully. Diagnosing SPD poses significant challenges primarily because individuals with this disorder may not see their behavior as problematic and are unlikely to seek help voluntarily. Moreover, the behaviors associated with SPD can overlap with other personality disorders, particularly antisocial personality disorder, making differential diagnosis difficult. The treatment for sadistic personality disorder is also complex and not well established. Psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, may be used to address underlying issues such as anger management, empathy development, and behavior modification. However, the effectiveness of these treatments is not well documented due to the rarity of the disorder and the difficulty in engaging these individuals in therapy. In addition to individual consequences, SPD can have significant social implications. Individuals with this disorder can cause severe emotional and physical harm to others, and their behavior can have a ripple effect on families, workplaces, and communities. The legal and ethical considerations in managing individuals with SPD are complex, as they often intersect with criminal behaviors. In conclusion, sadistic personality disorder represents a challenging and largely unexplored area in psychiatry. Its diagnosis, etiology, and treatment are subjects of ongoing research and debate. Understanding and addressing the needs of individuals with SPD, while ensuring the safety and well-being of those around them, remains a critical concern in mental health care.
Wife's family to drop the charges, and Sade laid the foundations for his reputation as a sadistic, depraved libertine for generations to come.
Person they called Ishi. Shiro Ishi. Shiro Ishi was raised in feudal Japan, where his family was the largest landowner in the community, one of 4 children. He was the one they brought over from Japan. They made a deal with the Japanese. Of course, it was a deal, right? To keep the records. So I think a person or 2 got charges, but not really, right? So anyhow, is this because within their own family trees, they're creating psychopaths? And now we can add the diagnosis of sadomasochism to the family trees, right? These psychopaths, they're brewing. They got this all started because they wanted to cross-contaminate people with animals. Then they started with vaccines. The first one they cross-contaminated was the cow. They cross-contaminated a cow with people and came up with smallpox. That is why we got the word vaccine. Vaccine is for vaca, meaning cow. So they first started cross-contaminating people with animals. Like that's ever going to do us any good, right? Then when they get the disease going, they come up with a cure in the form of pills or vaccines. All of this for a disease that they invented in a lab, and the labs are called BIOLABS. Some people right now are acting like Russia is out to get us and the stuff about Ukraine and the biolabs. But wait, who really runs them? Well, my opinion is the U.S. military. I opened with a couple of clips talking about they stopped doing this work. Well, let's put it this way. Maybe when there were some laws passed, the U.S. stopped doing the biolab work on U.S. territory. But at that stage, when they made that declaration in the 60s, why would it matter to them? Because by then they had U.S. military bases all over the place. So, yeah, and then all of these labs all over the place, well, they're likely all funded by the United States, right? So you can say all you want, yes, we are not conducting biolabs anymore. Well, yeah, that's partially true, right? Conducting your own biolabs, but funding a biolab in another country are 2 different questions, right? So it is such a all this animal business. What's happening is this: Because remember, this is about eugenics, so they don't really care about all of this stuff going on. You know, these diseases they supposedly cure, and the cultures that come out with animals, because the things that they produce, the end result, these vaccines and stuff, they can actually contain things like monkey kidney cells, newborn calf serum, bovine extract, and more recently, this tetani business, which is the cause agent for tetanus infection. Because all animal tissue mediums can carry known and unknown pathogenic viruses, bacterial genetic residues, and foreign DNA fragments that pose countless potential health risks. The science behind the manufacture of vaccines is extraordinarily primitive. Therefore, the CDC sets limits for how much genetic contamination by weight is permitted in a vaccine, and the agency over the years continues to increase the threshold. So this is basically the what's going on with what the cure looks like, right? So anybody in the public that thinks this is a good idea, well, we all need to learn more. Why not, right? So essentially, they're grabbing bats out of caves and stuff. They're grabbing cows, making the cows. You realize in the United States, we have the very first vaccine mandate for smallpox in the early 1800s. This is not new stuff. They've been using those vaccines as part of the eugenics program. And because it's going on in the news right now, and it came out of one of these labs, well, polio. What are they doing right now? Supposedly, they're calling a ceasefire in Palestine so they can get all the kids vaccinated from polio. I think it's likely to sterilize the children, right? So why on earth both sides are agreeing to stop the action supposedly because it's so important to shoot these kids up with polio vaccines? Well, I took a look into it. Amidst the polio vaccine debacle and mounds of scientific literature confirming the vaccine's failure, U.S. health agencies and the most ardent proponents of vaccines, such as Paul Offit and Bill Gates, retreat into the protected cloisters of medical denialism and continue to spew folk tales of polio vaccine successes. The polio vaccines on the market have not improved very much during the past 60 years. They continue to rely upon primitive manufacturing technology and animal tissue culturing. In recent years, Bill Gates' polio eradication campaigns in India have been dismal failures. Touted as one of the most expensive public health campaigns in history, according to Bloomberg Business, as many as 15 doses of oral polio vaccines failed to immunize the poorest of Indian children. Severe gastrointestinal damage due to contaminated water and wretched sanitation conditions have made the vaccine ineffective. Because here's what I've been saying for years. They never will give Africa or India, any of these countries, what they really need. What do they really need? Clean water. This does not take a team of scientists to figure out, right? This is how eugenics works. They act like they're going in to help. evil has to come packaged as help. So while we're over here thinking, oh, good for the USA, they're over helping children in India. No, they're giving them vaccines that have not worked for the last 60 years. They created that polio virus, right? We did not come loaded with diseases. They gave us these diseases. So anyhow, so yeah, so these poor kids in India, because they already have gastrointestinal damage due to contaminated water and the sanitation already. So here's the thing. I'll close with this. The case of India and other cases in other developed nations scientifically supports a claim vaccine opponents have stated for decades, and that is this: improve the sanitation, provide clean water, healthy food, and the means for better hygiene practices are the safest and most effective ways for fighting infectious disease. So, to me, I see these labs as these just insanely huge projects, right, to actually give us all of this stuff. And keep in mind the time during the World War II, the ovens were fake, and I covered that in a show already. There's really good evidence that those ovens were not true, and that's the number one thing that really triggers people. Because if you were to say to somebody, "Well, I don't think the ovens were true in Auschwitz," what are you, some kind of crazy person? How can you say those ovens weren't true? It really triggers people. But yes, in fact, the ovens were not true. And I went through all of this. I found somebody who did all the work. The doors went the wrong direction. Yeah, a lot of reasons that the ovens were fake. But while everybody is being so horrified over the ovens, right? Look what was really going on, right? Because then after the war, the United States brought those same doctors and scientists and said they were coming here to do the space industry, right? The Ishi person went to Fort Detrick. So the Japanese people, from what I can figure out, went to Fort Detrick. I'm going to be playing a clip here that talk about the worst case of some of these Nazi experiments. Let me see here. Yeah, I have that right. I had to stop and check real quick. I'm trying a new system today, so I'm just trying to stay focused on keeping all this straight. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna be playing this clip about the Nazi experiments, because then we're going to move on from here, because remember I said the guy from Japan ended up at Fort Detrick, right? Well, I've talked offhandedly as far as what biological weapons were used in Korea, and I haven't really been sure about whether they used bug technology in Korea. But in fact, they did do firebombing and bug and bacterial warfare in Korea. So that's an interesting date, because really just about, and that was in, I found a clip from the Chinese Ministry of Health, 1952, and they were saying that, hey, look, the United States is dropping bugs in Korea. So let's play this clip first, as far as what they were doing with these Nazi camp experiments. And people have done a lot of digging through different freedom of information and whatnot to come up with these things.
World War II saw extensive cruelty in every shape and every form. The Holocaust may stand as one of the most disturbing events in history, but the conflict also involved numerous other examples of when humanity steps not only well over the line, but into an area that can only be described as heinous. And our story today is one such example. With a name like the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, you might be forgiven for thinking that Japan's Unit 731, to use its informal name, was an admirable group fighting the good fight. But you couldn't be more wrong. To put it bluntly, the actions of this covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit, which regularly involved lethal human experimentation on males and females ranging in age from newborns to the elderly, were some of the darkest in a war filled with darkness. When we think of World War II, we often simply focus our attention on the European theatre of conflict. If you ask your good friend Google when the Second World War began, you will invariably be shown the date 1st of September 1939, the date German tanks rumbled into Poland, sparking declarations of war by both Britain and France. If you're a European, I suppose that this makes perfect sense. However, by this point, a war had been raging thousands of miles away for quite some time. Yet even here, dates surrounding the beginning of the Asian side of the global conflict can be a little conflicting. The Japanese invaded Chinese Manchuria on the 18th of September 1931, but this was a much smaller operation than what was to come and saw the Japanese annex the area before setting up a puppet government. 6 years later, however, the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, in which a Japanese soldier, Private Shimura Kikujiro, temporarily disappeared, giving the Japanese army the perfect excuse to cross the border to investigate. Private Kikujiro soon reappeared. Perhaps it was the worst timed toilet break in history, or maybe the Japanese fabricated the entire thing to find an excuse to start the war. Either way, a full military conflict was now underway, a full 2 years before Hitler's border-crossing escapades in Poland. The Second Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese occupation of mainland China saw brutality on a scale that rivaled the Nazis and sometimes even beat Herr Hitler into second place. The Battle of Shanghai, which began on the 13th of August 1937, was the first major conflict between the two sides and set a pattern that would be repeated countless times in the early stages of the war. The spirited Chinese defense, but ultimately a crushing victory by the Japanese. But this war soon took a dark turn with the events that occurred in and around the city of Nanjing in December 1937 and January 1938. The number of Chinese civilians that remained in Nanjing when the Japanese military overran the city has been debated ever since, with confusion over how many had already fled and just how many were now sheltering within the Nanking safety zone, a series of small areas mainly encompassing foreign embassies that, rather ironically, had been set up by a member of the Nazi Party. While the number of how many killed during the Nanjing massacre can be debated, the lowest estimate seems to be 30,000 and the highest 300,000, the savagery of what occurred has long been clear. Mass murder and mass rape enveloped the city as Japanese soldiers indiscriminately tore through Nanjing. It provided one of the most horrifying episodes across the entire war, but by this point the Japanese had begun something arguably even worse. To begin the story of Unit 731, we need to backtrack a little to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. At that point, there was an army unit with the name Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, which, as far as we know, began life as an innocent research and public health agency that dealt with protecting Japanese soldiers from chemical attacks on the battlefield. But this changed in 1932, when Surgeon General Shiro Ishii, Chief Medical Officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was placed in charge of this unit and formed a secret subgroup under the name Togo Unit, perhaps after General Hideki Togo, the Japanese politician and general of the Imperial Japanese Army, who had received the bulk of the blame for starting the war with the United States. The Togo Unit was tasked with investigating and developing biological and chemical warfare from the Zongma Fortress, a prison/experimentation camp in Beini, a village 100 kilometers, that's 62 miles south of Harbin on the South Manchurian Railway. This was a tiny village of around 300 homes, which the Japanese burned to the ground before expelling the local population, leaving only a large building that subsequently became the headquarters of the Togo Unit. Around the building, the Japanese constructed a prison camp that included a 3-meter high earthen wall topped with electrified barbed wire and a moat with a drawbridge. Inside, numerous buildings were erected, including housing units, barracks, and dining halls, but also laboratories, warehouses, and prison cells. This was all built with slave labor, mainly common criminals, captured bandits, anti-Japanese partisans, and political prisoners, all of whom were forced to wear blinders, like what you see on working horses, so they couldn't get a full idea of what was being constructed. Those involved in the construction of the most secretive buildings were executed as soon as work was completed. It had a capacity of 1,000, but it's thought that the prisoner population, who were referred to as logs because of the cover story that the site was a wood mill, usually hovered around 500 or 600. And here is where the horror begins. Once completed, the Japanese began rounding up prisoners, often criminals from the nearby area, mainly Chinese, but also a large number of Russian expatriates living in China. They were brought to the Zongma fortress and initially treated well with good food, including rice or wheat, meat and fish, and even a splash of alcohol to warm the body. But this was simply a disturbing attempt to bring the body into its natural healthy state before the experiments could begin. Now, I know that if you've come to a channel called Into the Shadows, you're probably expecting some pretty heavy material, but what occurred at the Zongma Fortress and its later incarnations was revulsion on an entirely different level. It was here that Japanese doctors and scientists conducted experiments on the prison population that looked at everything from the effects of the plague, cholera, starvation, water deprivation, frostbite, new weapons, and much more. This was a sadistic house of horror, but the Zongma Fortress was just the start, and we'll be going into some of those experiments a little later in the video. In the summer of 1934, around 40 prisoners escaped the Zongma fortress. Heavy rains had disabled the electrical fences, allowing escapees to scale the perimeter despite being shackled at the feet. 10 were immediately killed by the guards on duty, while many were dragged back in to be subjected to the kind of torture that probably made their early experience in Zongma seem like a holiday camp. However, 16 prisoners managed to elude the Japanese and disappeared into the neighboring countryside, and with that, Japan's dark secret was out. In response, Zongma was closed in 1935, but this simply led to another, even larger facility being operated in Pingfang, approximately 24 kilometers south of Harbin. The following year, the Togo unit received a major shake-up and came under the direct jurisdiction of the Imperial Army while being divided into two, the Ishi unit and the Wakamatsu unit. Initially together, they were known as the Epidemic Prevention Department, but from August 1940, it was referred to as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, or Unit 731. At its largest, Unit 731, stationed in Pingfang, was composed of 300 researchers, including doctors and bacteriologists, who would sometimes publish their findings in peer-reviewed scientific journals, failing to mention that many of the experiments were done on humans and not monkeys, as was stated. But this was just one section of a much larger, grim web that eventually included around 10,000 people across numerous units stationed in Manchuria, but also elsewhere, including Unit 1855 in Beijing, Unit EI 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou, and later Unit 9420 in Singapore. The main location for Unit 731 was the site in Harbin, which measured 6 square kilometers, that's 2.3 square miles, and included more than 150 buildings, many of which were factories used to produce chemicals or biological agents, and the Harbin complex could produce 30 kilograms of bubonic plague bacteria in just a few days. It was said that it included around 4,500 containers used to raise fleas, 6 enormous cauldrons to produce various chemicals, and around 1,800 large containers to produce biological agents. The typical life expectancy of prisoners in Unit 731 was about 2 months, though there were instances of some surviving for as long as 12 months, but these cases were often pregnant women who the Japanese wanted to give birth in order to investigate the effects of various diseases on the newborn child. And before we move on to talk about the experiments themselves, let's just be very clear about what kind of facility we're talking about here. Nobody who came through the gates as a prisoner ever left alive. The darkest actions carried out under the guise of Unit 731 came under the code name Maruta, meaning logs, and varied wildly. It's difficult to know where to start in this pit of absolute hell, so let's just get straight into it. Many of the early experiments focused on how the body reacts to certain diseases, and many prisoners were infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases. And that was just the start. While the Japanese were certainly interested in the visible external effects, it was often what was happening inside the body that they were really interested in. Vivisections, where the body is dissected for experimental purposes, was a common practice in Unit 731 on living humans, always without anesthetic and with a rag stuffed into the mouth of the poor soul going under the knife to muffle the screams. This was done so researchers could examine the effect of certain diseases on different bodily organs, but there has certainly been plenty of suggestion that at least some of the horror seen in Unit 731 was done so purely for sadistic pleasure. And it gets even weirder from here. Sometimes limbs would be amputated and reattached at different places on the body, or internal organs removed and then added back in, but in different locations. Other prisoners were subjected to chemical weapons testing, including mustard gas, lucite, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, adamsite, and phosgene gas. Sometimes this was done in secure chambers, while there were widespread reports of large-scale experiments on the effects of mustard gas where prisoners were tied to posts outside. This was also done with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax before it was taken to the next stage of testing, which was usually done on a live Chinese population, either through poisoned wells, aircraft drops, or fleas and other animals that had been infected with the disease. While the Japanese were eager to test the next generation of weapons that could kill thousands in one fell swoop, they didn't neglect the tried and tested. Prisoners were used to test new grenades, flamethrowers, and even bombs, which saw prisoners tied to posts at increasing distances from the explosion so that the damage radius could be measured. With new guns and bullets, wound patterns and penetration depths were carefully recorded, and the same was done with bayonets, knives, and swords. Experimentation regarding hypothermia was also a keen subject of interest in Unit 731 and typically involved limbs of prisoners being submerged in icy water until they were effectively frozen solid. Then researchers, or sadistic lunatics, depending on how you want to call them, experimented to find the best way of heating the limb to return it to its normal state, sometimes using fire or boiling water, and sometimes simply leaving the poor wretch overnight to see what would happen. And yet, I feel like I've said this already, that wasn't the worst of it. The Japanese also did extensive experimentation to find out how quickly the human body would suffer from hypothermia and then die of exposure. They introduced different variables, such as when the prisoner had last eaten and what they had and what they were wearing and how much salt and protein they had in their body before the experiment. To perhaps sum up the horrifying actions of Unit 731 in one dreadful example, they found that a newborn baby will die in roughly 3 days if left unattended outside. And I know that seems like a lot, but that's just scratching the surface. Other experiments include giving prisoners the wrong blood transfusion or the blood of animals, injections of seawater, the human body's tolerance for G-force using a rotating chamber, prolonged X-ray exposure, rape and forced pregnancy, and probably a whole lot more that we'll never completely know about. There were even horrific stories of bodies and body parts being pickled in formaldehyde, with the only labels visible being the nationality of whoever was inside. With Japanese hopes fading towards the end of World War II, there appears to have been high-level discussion regarding the use of chemical or biological weapons against the Allies and even on the US mainland. This would be done using information and methods taken from the research done by Unit 731. It's impossible to say how close this actually came, though an attack codenamed Operation Cherry Blossom at Night, which called for biological attack on Southern California, was certainly at some degree of planning when Japan surrendered in September 1945. As the war ended and Japan surveyed its destroyed country, Unit 731 was disbanded and its facilities in Manchuria and on the Japanese mainland were destroyed, along with much of the information regarding what had happened there. Prisoners remaining in the camps after Japan's surrender were quickly executed and their bodies disposed of. But this was not something you could keep under wraps. When the Americans arrived in Japan, rumors of chemical and biological testing swirled, but little to no information was openly given to the Americans for obvious reasons. It was only when the threat of Soviet involvement, and no doubt vicious vengeance, came into play that Japan's dark secrets surrounding Unit 731 were shared with the United States. A dossier detailing what occurred soon found its way to the desk of General Douglas MacArthur, the man tasked with rebuilding Japan, and some big decisions needed to be made over possible prosecutions. If there were ever war crimes committed, it was under the dark scope of Unit 731. However, the end of World War II saw an almost immediate pivot away from past enemies and towards new ones. For the Americans, the Japanese were no longer the enemy, and they would do whatever they could to make life hard for those devious Soviets. General MacArthur authorized blanket immunity for those who worked in Unit 731 in exchange for sole ownership of the information and findings which the United States deemed hugely valuable. In the Tokyo trials, which saw 28 Japanese military and political leaders tried for a variety of crimes, there was only a single solitary mention of chemical poisoning in occupied China and absolutely nothing about probably the worst macabre experimentation unit across the entire war. The Soviets weren't at all satisfied with this and instigated their own trials known as the Khabarovsk War Crimes Trial, which began in December 1949. A total of 12 men were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to between 2 and 25 years in Siberian labor camps. Now, you might be thinking, well, at least they got what they deserved, but, well, not really. Considering what happens in Unit 731, these sentences were extraordinarily lenient. And would you know it, most of those convicted soon found their way back to Japan, reportedly after handing over some of the secrets from Unit 731 to the Soviets. The United States refused to acknowledge the Khabarovsk trials, labeling them as Soviet propaganda, but it's crystal clear that both the US and the Soviet Union let those responsible for the horror in Unit 731 off the hook for their own gain. What followed was decades of near silence in Japan, with successive governments denying all knowledge of the activities of Unit 731. But by the turn of the millennium, with more and more people speaking out about it, including those who had worked there, it was only a matter of time. In August 2008, the Tokyo District Court ruled for the first time that Japan had engaged in biological warfare and directly named the work done by Unit 731. In 2018, after a request by Professor Katsuo Nishiyama of the Shiga University of Medical Science, the National Archives of Japan released the names of 3,607 members of Unit 731, all of whom had lived freely since the end of the war, and many of whom had since died. Apart from the 12 men who faced the ethically shaky Soviet trial in 1949, absolutely nobody was ever held accountable for their actions at the unit. In fact, many of them went on to quite illustrious careers in post-war Japan. In 2002, at an international symposium on the crimes of bacteriological warfare in China, the number of people deemed to have been killed through Japanese chemical and biological warfare programs was estimated at 580,000, and that includes those killed through attacks outside the walls of Unit 731, as well as those inside. It's impossible to know the true number of those killed by Unit 731, but it's thought that at least 3,000 men, women, and children were experimented on and killed in the Pingfang site alone. This was not a place where anybody left alive. Everybody who walked through the gates died one way or the other. The vast majority of these were Chinese, but large numbers of Russians and Koreans also perished in the facilities, along with lesser numbers of Mongols, Americans, British, and French. I said right at the start of today's video that World War II delivered some sickening events and despicable cruelty, but the actions of Unit 731 were on a different level. This wasn't just blind torture, and most of the experiments came with very particular purposes that in some ways actually managed to further scientific understanding, both for peaceful and military means, which is why both the US and the Soviet Union were so eager to gain access to the information. This may have been done under the shadowy guise of scientific experimentation, but it was some of the most sadistic, cruel science that you're ever likely to see.
Okay, I went ahead and played both clips so I don't kind of start to get clip crazy here. A person named Traub, the Nazi name Traub that was mentioned. What I'm going to be doing from here on out is filling in details that weren't part of those clips. The first place that was doing the BIOLABS stuff was called Incel Riems, R-I-E-M-S. That is in Germany, around the 19th time frame. Next place was Fort Detrick in Maryland. That became the Army's biological warfare headquarters. And to the CIA, it laid the groundwater for Fort Detrick's offshore germ warfare animal disease lab on Plum Island. So, Plum Island, Traub was the founding father, so they called that Lab 257. So the person, Traub, evidently was brought over, and what I did was I found a lot of information that people had dug through Freedom of Information and found. It said, and Plum Island's purpose, says the book, became what Incel Riems had been, to develop biological warfare to be directed against animals in the Soviet Union now that the Cold War and conflict between the U.S. and Soviet Union had begun. So, interestingly enough, the Japanese guy, Shiki, that went from Japan to Fort Detrick. Well, in 1952, I found a copy, and I'll put it at the top down below because it's really important to watch these things. It came from the Chinese Minister of Health in 1952 in January, and it asserted that the enemy has furiously employed continuous bacterial warfare in Korea and in our Northeast and Qingdao areas, dropping flies, mosquitoes, spiders, ants, bedbugs, fleas, 30-odd species of bacteria-carrying insects. They were dropping them over a very wide area. Examinations confirmed the microorganisms involving things like plague, bacillus, cholera, meningitis, parathoid, salmonella, relapsing fire, some other bacteria, typhus, rickettsia, etc. The Chinese government, in turn, developed a prevention program involving the extermination of pests and flies and the protection of water sources that curtailed some of the effects. Survivor testimonials confirm the presence of flies, flies, the buzz around, not native to the region, and that people died from disease outbreaks, including the bubonic plague. Some historians claim to have unearthed documents proving that the Soviets assisted the North Korean government in creating fake containment zones, though others have questioned the authenticity of the documents and noted that they pointed to possible manipulation in 2 of the 13 sites. Archival evidence on the American side reveals that the military had developed a capacity for producing and delivering bacteriological weapons through expertise acquired secretly from the Japanese scientists, such as General Shido Ishii, commander of Kwontong's Army Unit 731. Ishii's unit practiced biological warfare in China during World War II, resulting in the deaths of 585,000 Chinese. Rescued from prosecution as a grade A war criminal, Ishii allegedly made several visits to South Korea during the Korean War and collaborated with scientists at the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Center at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Funny how that works out, right? According to this Professor Marquis, who had studied the activities for Unit 731, there are striking similarities between the diseases and weapons used by the Japanese military in China in World War II and those that were said to have been deployed by the United States against targets in northern Korea. The bombs found on the Korean peninsula were made of metal, while those used in China were ceramic, Maury stated. But the symptoms reported in North Korea are very similar to those witnessed in China. So just to give you a flavor for what kind of people the U.S. military employs to run these missions, I want to give you an example. What kind of monsters were over there dropping this stuff? Full disclosure, I've had a lot of conflict in my own mind. My father was a U.S. Air Force navigator. He would have been in knowledge and the person who dropped some of these things. I still wrangle with that terribly. Obviously, as a navigator, my father would have known what was being dropped. I think they were doing two things there. They were firebombing and they were also dropping these bugs. Couple of reasons for the firebombing, because if you remember, right before World War II, when they bombed Japan, right before that, they needed to test the firebombing, and they also needed to test the B-29, those planes that were used in the firebombing. Well, where did they test them? They first tested them in Wuhan, China. So if you don't think these biology labs and stuff are all connected to the US, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, but all this people say, oh, all these biology is going on in China, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's pretty much a diversion. So first, so I have a lot of issues as far as what my father's role was in general as a navigator, but as the man that he was, he would not have ever spoken about it. He would have taken his security seriously, and he would have done as he was told. So who were the kind of horrible people running these kinds of operations? The horror, Korea's Lieutenant Kurtz, Donald Nichols, a U.S. Air Force officer who worked in military intelligence, was the embodiment of the dark side of American participation in the Korean War. Can you see, it's one thing just randomly talking about these labs, but let's take a look at all sides of the impact of these labs, right? So this Lieutenant Donald Nichols, Nichols, he issued bounties for these severed body parts and heads of captured communist agents. He threw POWs off of helicopters. He recruited defectors for suicidal missions into the North. He also witnessed the systematic torture and massacre of Korean civilians. According to a biographer, Nichols was falsely diagnosed as a schizophrenic after the war and subjected to electroshock treatments in order to erase his memory. See what they do to their own, right? They turned this psychopath loose. I'm pretty sure this Nichols guy had likely had his own personality split, right? That's who we're surrounded by. Psychopaths, sadists who have their personalities. So oddly enough, they diagnosed him as schizophrenic after the war. I've talked enough about that. That schizophrenia diagnosis is to erase our memories. So I'll keep reading. In many ways, Nichols was a real-life version of Lieutenant Kurtz, a character in Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War film Apocalypse Now, who had formed his own private army, which engaged in wild-scale torture and eschewed all civilian norms. He writes in his book, King of Spies, the dark region of America's spy master in Korea that pretty much like Kurtz. Nichols was an uncontrollable commander in a faraway shadow land. He was a highly decorated U.S. Air Force intelligence officer who ran his own secret war for more than a decade, in which he lost touch with propriety, with morality, and legality, even with sanity, if military psychiatrists are to be believed. Nichols grew up poor in Hassenhack, New Jersey, and in Florida during the Depression in a broken family. His mother was promiscuous which led him to speak disparagingly of women, and his father beat him. As the youngest boy in the family, Donald wore hand-me-down clothes and became known for his violent temper. Chronic childhood hunger caused a lifelong struggle with obesity and psychopathic binging on Coca-Cola and chocolate. At 14, Nicholas dropped out of high school to help support his family through odd jobs. He found refuge in the army and was assigned a job policing the docks in Karachi, which earned him promotion to Master Sergeant. Sorry, I went flying past it. Nicholas subsequently won a spot in the Army's Counterintelligence Corps and became a police advisor in South Korea during the period of U.S. occupation. He began developing teams of secret agents who would infiltrate the South Korean Labor Party and identify threats of sabotage and commie cells. Throughout his work, Nichols developed a close friendship with South Korean leader Syngmi Rhee and became one of his closest advisors. They wrote that in Nicholas, Rhee discovered a backdoor for delivering intelligence that could influence American policy toward Korea. He referred to the young American as my son, Nichols. According to an Air Force historian, the personal ties that Nichols maintained for more than a decade with a foreign head of state had no parallel in the history of U.S. military operations. Incredibly, one had to ask, what the hell is a 23-year-old Air Force sergeant doing in the role of private confidant to a head of state? Nichols met weekly and supplied arms to Kim Snake, was his nickname, Snake Chang-roy, a former Japanese military officer who served as Rhee's right-hand man for anti-communist score settling and vengeance. The Snake was believed to have masterminded the execution of thousands of South Koreans, according to the findings of a later government inquiry. Nicholas sat in on police torture sessions where the water torture methods was employed and suspects were burned with lit cigarettes and wired to a wooden cross and subjected to electroshock. The capture and execution of senior communist leaders was often confirmed by cutting off their heads and sending them in gasoline cans to Army headquarters in Seoul. A photo of Nichols shows him and several other Army officers inspecting the heads. In another, the photo shows a guerrilla leader was being pulled out of its box by the hair. After the North Korean invasion of the South, Nichols witnessed the massacre of hundreds of South Koreans. In his memoirs, he misstated where the massacres took place in order to uphold the official army narrative that blamed the killings on the communists and allegations reportedly the uncritical army of the history of the Korean War. Nichols earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest medal of honor. Well, now, isn't that handy, right? Now, I don't believe for a second, of course, you can have your own thoughts. I don't believe for a second that this person was just over there randomly doing all this stuff. He also had a sexual predator, later arrested for fondling young boys. Nicholas is alleged to have been supplied with South Korean officers for his sexual pleasure. He killed 3 of his own agents who tried to assassinate him after they burst into his quarters in an apparent mutiny. Well, they said that, let me see, this person, Lee Kun-soon, who was shot by Nichols but survived, said Nichols was headstrong and had a reputation that terrified many Koreans. He didn't care for human rights. In his own autobiography, Nichols included a description of the methods he used to eliminate dangerous or untrustworthy agents, which included throwing them out of an aircraft in a paper-packed parachute and dumping them off the back of a boat in the nude at high speed. Better yet, he said, give them false information plants and let the enemy do it for you. Nichols' nephew stated that after he returned home from Korea, he had a large amount of cash, which he kept in his freezer. The money may have derived from currency manipulation schemes that were widely prevalent among army officers in Korea and the illicit selling of military equipment, though Nichols handled a lot of cash in running secret agents. In 1957, this is something else. In 1957, he was relieved of his command for undisclosed abuse of authority, and he was put in a straitjacket and admitted for psychiatric treatment. His nephew stated that Donald had told him the government wanted to erase his brain because he knew too much. Nichols' career embodies the immorality of the Korean War, which gave men like him a legal license to murder. See, here's why I think that they don't care, because the whole idea of war is to rob of whatever wealth these countries have or plunder their land. And this is all, a lot of it, behind what they gain in terms of money. What also do they gain in terms of their own satisfaction of sadism, right? By openly murdering people, getting away with it, watching people starve to death, watching people die very slow deaths of poisoning and stuff. That really defines sadism, right? For the United States, the war fostered the quadrupling of defense budgets. See, there's always a catch. So what happened was the U.S. had a defense budget of $13 billion in 1949. That defense budget, because of all these fears, all those Jews, all those Nazis and stuff, right? The defense budget went to $54 billion, which is more than $500 billion in 2016 dollars. It also, in 1953, it hastened government investment in military scientific research and development. It hastened the need to stockpile strategic raw materials, resulted in intensified exploitation of the mineral resources of Latin America and Africa, and closer alliances with colonial and dictator regimes. The war further consolidated the U.S. position in Southeast Asia, an enormous foreign military base structure, and a powerful military-industrial complex to service it. What was most indelible about it, I'm talking about the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. I was born in 1951 when my dad was at the Korean War. It says, what was indelible about it was the extraordinary destructiveness of the United States air campaigns against North Korea. From the widespread and continuous use of firebombing, mainly with napalm, to threats to use nuclear and chemical weapons, and the destruction of huge North Korean dams in the final stages of the war. As a result, almost every substantial building in North Korea was destroyed. I think North Korea was a testing ground for this bug business, right? Because right after World War II, remember, supposedly the testing stopped, right? Well, it didn't stop. So I think this is a lot of the reason exactly for North Korea, or the Korean War, to kill off a bunch of people is always their first goal, right? But the second would be to test all of this dangerous bug things. So I've been saying for years now, they always talk like in that Bible as far as all these famines and stuff, right? Well, they're talking about locusts and insects descending on the crops, eating them all. I mean, how hard would it be to drop a bunch of bugs, in poor countries? This is not the work of real genius level thinking, right? So, let me see here. They said that North Korean cities and villages were either rubble or snow-covered wastelands. And also, General Curtis LeMay coordinated the bombing raids against North Korea. And Curtis LeMay was the one who bombed Japan. They bombed Japan, but right before Japan, they bombed Wuhan. Then, also under LeMay, they bombed, Dresden. But they didn't have the heart to bomb Belgium. So yeah, that's all thanks to Curtis LeMay. So he went on to say, Curtis LeMay said, over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population. We burned down every town in North Korea and South Korea. So, then this person had a question, said, an important question for the American people. How can a country which has lost a quarter of its population resulting from U.S. aggression constitute a threat to the American homeland? Well, none of this has ever been a threat, right? They just say it's a threat. So, yeah, it was those B-29s. Okay, so what's coming out of some of these labs? Well, these lab breaks, once they get started, they came to happen over and over. Just recently, in the last couple of weeks, they had an outbreak of anthrax that has killed at least 50 cattle and 1 moose in Wyoming. So we actually had Lyme disease. They claim that Lyme disease had existed for over 5,000 years. It was only discovered in 1975. And it talked about that in that clip, so I won't go into it all, but basically, some epidemiologists from Yale University were visiting the town to study cases of juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which appeared mainly in summer. Following their research, the experts concluded that this was, in fact, an infectious disease transmitted by an arthropod vector, which they named Lyme arthritis. So, another interesting thing, when I was looking all around, I found probably one of the better histories of Barack Obama. Hi, I'm Barack Obama. I'm the black guy here. They brought in the black guy to do all these terrific things. Where'd he come from? Well, just interestingly enough, I found a picture. It said also during the 1950s, Dulles and the SS, meaning Dr. Joseph Mengele, began to get into something big and extremely above top secret. So they were involved in some conference, and it was a picture that his mom and them had attended this conference with Mengele and them. And the conference was called, it was involved Top Secret MK Ultra. And in the picture was Barack Obama's mother and his grandparents, Stanley and Durham and Madeline Durham. So yeah, Barack Obama's mother was CIA and his mother's parents were also CIA. All of this is in the family. Every single little tiny bit of it is in the family. That's why it's pretty safe to conclude that all of these people in charge have had this mind-splitting business. Keep in mind that every single U.S. president, except for one, is related to each other. Just think about that, okay? Because all they did, they started in Germany. They seem to be a strong affinity for Germany. They start in Germany with Rhyme. Then they did Fort Detrick. Then they did Plum Island. So I think it's all about just putting new faces on colonialism, right? Because they want to keep control of things in different ways, but not really my point for today. Because all along, this has been an unwitting human experiments, right? They say the early experiments in unwitting human radiation exposure were carried out under the umbrella of the Manhattan Project and overseen by a medical researcher named Joseph Hamilton. I think you will also note all these big universities, well, they all started on the basis of eugenics. Stanford, all of them. This is their belief. I'm pretty much at the end of all this. I think we got the picture about these biolabs, right? These biolabs right now are going on today. People talk about, well, is it going on in Ukraine or is it going on in Russia? What difference does it make? The point is that it is going on. It is going on all over the world, and I believe that it is being funded by the U.S. military. Simple as that, right? They have been doing things in the 50s. They carried out things called Operation Sea Spray, where they took the coast of San Francisco and California and they sprayed us with 2 types of bacteria. These bacteria, they said, were safe, but the one bacteria is now listed as a pathogen which causes food poisoning and can hurt anyone with a weak immune system. Of that one incident, 11 people were admitted to hospital with serious bacteria. In 1951, tests were also carried out at the Norfolk Naval Supply Center in Virginia. Most of the workers were African American. They were doing things out there. I could go on and on for the next week or two. They have been testing on us since the very, very beginning. Ever since they took over the very first place in Germany, it became a hunting lab for the rest of us. And you can tell by the way they brought over these different people. No doubt in my mind, they were all working together, right? They all have the same mission. The same mission is about eugenics. So we now have this trial person going between all of those facilities. So obviously they set up, quite simply, Fort Detrick first, then Traub, who had experience with the Riems in Germany, who was also at Fort Detrick, was there and set up the place on Plum Island. There's lots of documentation that I found by reading through all these books and stuff that people were saying, well, this person saw Traub on the island. And then they were doing all kinds of other things. And every time the U.S. would get blamed for something, they always had some idea why they didn't do it. Because, for example, in May of 1971, pigs in Havana, Cuba, they were diagnosed with African swine fever. The virus spread and some 700,000 pigs were slaughtered. The United Nations Food and Agriculture called the Cuban virus outbreak the most alarming event of the year. Well, why'd they do that? Well, because pork production was one of Cuba's few commodities. Facing a severe food shortage, Havana residents had to actually hide their pigs with relatives in the countryside. The African swine fever is devastating to swine. So yeah, according to the federal government, Plum Island is the only location in the United States where the African swine fever virus is permitted. No one will say on the record that virus for the Cuban mission was prepared on Plum Island and sent to Fort Gulick. However, given the frequent travel between Plum Island and Fort Detrick, samples with or without the USDA's knowledge of the ultimate purpose could have been sent by courier to Fort Detrick for transshipment to Fort Gulick. The center aimed to investigate animal pathogens to protect farmers, ranchers, and the country's food projection from food outbreaks. So yeah, they're always doing things because they're worried about us, right? Because this all started back in, let me see here. In 1954, a prison doctor in Kentucky isolated 7 black inmates and fed them double, triple, and quadruple doses of LSD for 77 days straight. Okay, and then they said they may have died without knowing they were part of the CIA's highly secretive program to develop ways to control minds. A program based out of the little-known army base with a dark past, Fort Detrick. Indigenous to East Africa, African swine fever has never before appeared in North America, except at Plum Island. The USDA lab held no less than 7 virus strains in its freezers since 1954. So yeah, Plum Island. Then interestingly enough, I'm going to be closing this out. This could go on for years, right? And then they had this Lone Star tick that was out there. I mean, people saw this Traub guy on the island. They saw him when ticks were released. It is believed by some that the BB bacterium escaped the island. Let me see, because approximately 500,000 individuals contract Lyme disease annually, which translates to around 1,300 new cases each day. The disease notably began to spread during the 1970s in Connecticut, close to Plum Island. In 1971, the New York Times described the facility as a devil's island for the deadliest animal disease germs known to man, and described the elaborate security measures. Well, yeah, but they really don't care when things escape. Plum Island right now has moved to Kansas, so they took all these deadly viruses. So through all this, speaking of deadly viruses, there's a man named Professor Carl Grossman. I ran into Professor Grossman because early on he was a reporter for a local newspaper, and he did this report about Plum Island that kind of shook the people on Plum Island up because he was telling the truth and they really didn't want the truth out there. So anyways, long story short, this went on years ago where this Dr. Grossman got onto Plum Island because you can't just hop over there. So he gets onto Plum Island, and so anyways, so I got curious about Professor Grossman because I read that he's still alive, and so I started looking for other interviews he's done. Well, he's done quite a lot, and as it turns out, Professor Grossman is also interested in what's going on in these nuclear places. My view is we have nuclear places in the United States for the purpose of creating plutonium to use for our smart meters. So I'll get back to more of that later because there's also been there's just been some crazy increases in the efforts to do more nuclear plants in this country. It's all being pushed under this green thing, but my head's a little full today. But anyway, so Professor Grossman seemed like a pretty good guy, right? And so, anyway, so I don't know. I was just looking him up and I tuned into one of his interviews. And here's what he said. See, I've had to look at all this stuff with these nuclear power plants that we have all over this country, kind of from the sideways, right? So, what he was saying was this. Let me tell you what he said first. I'm kind of starting to wander off here. Okay. Oh, let me finish up this Plum Island thing. Since 2010, due to a 2008 decision by the Department of Homeland Security, they moved to a more secure location in Kansas. Well, I can't wait for the stuff to hop out there, right? According to the Department of Agriculture, technology is now sufficiently advanced that the study of foot and mouth disease can now be safely continued on the mainland. So little reason remains to continue the research on an inconvenient, outdated island facility. Well, that's good to know. So now they've taken it from a remote place, which they had a great deal of trouble containing things on this remote place, and now they've moved it to Kansas. Good for them, right? So, anyway, okay, so I'm listening to this interview. I'm about an hour into the interview, and they're talking about. I don't want to make this confusing. If you would have asked me a few years ago if I found nuclear plants interesting, I would have said, "What, are you crazy?" No, because now I find nuclear plants very interesting. But anyway, so they were talking about the rods that they use in these nuclear plants are very critical, okay? So what they said was this: the cladding for the fuel rods, they tried stainless steel and other metals, then they settled on zirconium. Pound for pound explosive as nitroglycerin. So they were just kind of randomly talking about these nuclear plants, and he was just surprised. He was very surprised that they had tried stainless steel and these other metals, and then they decided on zirconium. And he went on to say that pound for pound, zirconium is as explosive as nitroglycerin, which releases hydrogen gas, and the zirconium explodes itself like nitroglycerin. See, I've been saying all along, though, they're ticking time bombs, right? So now you've got inside of those plants are also highly explosive. I wonder, I know in Nebraska we have the nuclear place we have here is called Cooper. All kinds of problems with these places. I mean, leakage and all kinds of stuff. I wonder if just one of these plants blows up, which I'm sure is going to happen at some point, right? So I wonder how far the explosion would be based on knowing these plants are loaded with zirconium. So I wrote to him. No one ever answers me. But I write to people, but no one answers me. But here's what I wrote to him. I said, "Dear Professor Grossman, first of all, thanks for all of your work. I ran across your name while researching Plum Island. Then I found a recent interview and was pleased to find you. I was reading about Plum Island, and there was a story about how you got onto Plum Island, and I thought, what a clever move he made. I imagine anyone trying that move today would be tossed into the ocean before getting to the island. I am very interested in learning more about zirconium. Would you be willing to talk to me? I am wondering out loud if they use zirconium because of how explosive it really is. I have a theory about power plants, and it makes sense that they use something this explosive. At least to me, it makes sense." So that's what I said. It says, zirconium is used in nuclear reactors to provide the cladding or outer covering for the cylindrical fuel rods that power a nuclear reactor. Packed inside the zirconium cladding are pellets of uranium oxide and other fissionable materials. Zirconium is the metal of choice in this application because it absorbs relatively few of the neutrons produced in a fission reaction, and because the metal is highly resistant to both heat and chemical corrosion. Well, okay, so the people that are doing these plants, they're claiming that zirconium is a good thing, right? Well, of course they would be. They wouldn't be saying, hey, it's really explosive. So I tend to think that this Professor Grossman is onto something, right? Because he just kind of said in this offhanded way, he said, well, I kind of surprised why they did this. Well, I'm not surprised why they did this because they want to make those power plants as explosive as possible, right? I imagine they're being used to get the plutonium they need for the smart meters to pump into our homes right now, right? So what happens if they explode a few of them? Does that take everybody out? No idea. I'm just putting it out there. At this point, it seems like I have more questions than answers. So I'm going to be closing this off for now. It's pretty clear to me they have this very twisted, and I think that it is fair to call this pretty disturbed, right? And just think about all of those tests that they came up with. What kind of mind would think that up? Clearly, only a sadist, a person highly motivated by watching, getting their own sick pleasure out of all this kid deal, all this torture deal. it makes a great deal of sense to me that we can comfortably say that psychopaths clearly practice sadism, and they themselves are sadomasochists, right? They enjoy watching this. Just think back. Remember early movies? Remember Scrooge, little Timmy, little crippled kid, he wouldn't give him a piece of bread. This is who they are. They do not care about the rest of us because they are, in fact, psychopaths. So be safe out there, and I'll talk to you later.
This episode of the Y-Files is brought to you by Henson Shaving. In July 2008, the carcass of an animal washed up on the beach at Montauk Point, Long Island. Local beachcombers are used to seeing dead animals, seagulls, fish, crabs, even the occasional whale, but they had never seen anything like this. Animal experts were brought in to identify it. They were stumped. It looked like part dog, part reptile, and part rodent with the beak of a bird. This animal, whatever it was, became known as the Montauk Monster. But where did the monster come from? There could be only one answer: Plum Island. Plum Island is just a few miles from where the monster was found. Locals heard rumors that this was a top-secret government facility that created bioweapons, engineered animal hybrids, and maybe even experimented on people. Sounds like a wild theory. But then another animal washed up on the beach. Again, it couldn't be identified. And then another animal, and then two more. In 2010, the rumors about Plum Island seemed to be true when something else was found on the beach. This time it wasn't a strange animal, it was a body. A human body. Well, almost human.
Hang on, honey, hang on. I'm gonna deal with it. Just give me a second. Will you calm down? Hey, human!
What are you doing?
I'm glad you're there. Look, I'm in the midst of an emergency. I need to borrow your car, $2,000, and 2 pair of your wife's patios.
What is going on? You were supposed to be here 2 days ago,
But there's been extenuating circumstances.
Extenuating circumstances.
It means beyond my control.
I know what it means.
Okay, so car, cash, pantyhose, stat.
Just calm down a minute. What is the emergency?
Gertie and I have a photo shoot for the Modern Goldfish.
What the heck is the Modern Goldfish?
Hello, it's a goldfish lifestyle magazine. You haven't seen copies of it in my bathroom?
Yeah, I don't go into your bathroom. I was in there 6 months ago and I'm still in therapy.
What a snowflake. So, the Modern Goldfish is doing a profile on me, and I got my Rolex, my bespoke suit, and now I just need a nice close shave.
What does any of this have to do with me?
Well, I need $2,000 for disposable razors.
$2,000 for razors?
Razors are expensive, and Gertie also needs a shave. I'm not using her razors again. You ever try to shave your face after your wife uses your razor for her legs?
Well, yeah, the razor gets dull.
Well, imagine your wife's legs were the size of a camel hump.
I don't want to imagine that.
Well, I used one of Gertie's razors, and I thought I was going to rip one of my gills off. I don't want to damage my moneymaker.
God forbid. Look, you don't need any of those disposable razors. Just try Henson Shaving.
Oh, is that today's sponsor?
It sure is. Henson Shaving is a family-run aerospace business that makes a precision quality safety razor. The Henson AL13 has a cost of ownership that's way less than disposable or electric razors. It's completely plastic-free, and the replacement blades cost about 10 cents each, so you can always have a safe, close shave.
Ooh, this sounds fantastic.
It is, and there aren't any subscription programs or monthly deliveries, just a solid, long-lasting, dependable razor. Click the link in the description to get your very own Henson AL13 and use the code THE-Y-FILES to get 100 free blades with your order. That'll give you 3 to 5 years worth of shaves.
Okay, I'm on it, but look, I'm still gonna need those pantyhose.
I know I'm gonna regret asking this, but why do you need a pair of pantyhose?
2 pairs.
Why do you need them?
Well, why do you think? After Gertie shaves her legs, she gets cold. Have you ever seen chicken skin on a camel's legs? It ain't pretty. So tell your wife to make with the pantyhose toot sweet. What is it, baby? What is it? Hang on, I'll ask. Hey, so she wants you to make sure they're fishnets.
Less than 2 miles off the coast of Long Island and about 85 miles from New York City is a small island owned by the US government and unidentified on most maps. It's only accessible by ferry or by helicopter, but don't try visiting. Even if you have top secret clearance, access to Plum Island is invitation only. Boats that wander too close are quickly chased away by armed military personnel. Officially, the island is home to the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, a federal research facility that studies livestock-related diseases, specifically foot and mouth disease and African swine fever. These are highly contagious diseases that affect cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. The Plum Island Animal Disease Center is the only lab in the US authorized to work with live FMD samples. If these samples escape the island, it could devastate the country's food supply in a matter of weeks. Foot and mouth is so contagious that if a single case is found in imported meat, all meat imports from that country are instantly banned. In 2001, the UK had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease that resulted in a loss of almost $10 billion and the slaughter of more than 6 million animals, whether they were infected or not. The center also studies African and classical swine fevers as well as avian flu. Now, there's no question that since the 1950s, Plum Island has studied diseases that affect livestock. But Plum Island's true history is much darker. For years, stories circulated that Plum Island was conducting genetic experiments on animals and possibly on people. So when the bodies of strange animals began washing up on beaches around the Long Island Sound, it could mean only one thing. The rumors about Plum Island were true. The Manhattan Monster was found along the East River. Then another creature washed up. And this one kind of looked like a pig, but you don't see a lot of those running around New York City. Besides, pigs have 4 toes on each foot that ends in a hoof. The Manhattan Monster's feet had 5 toes that ended in what looked like claws.
Ooh, did it have the body of a crab and the head of a cat?
No, it had
That would be a crab cat.
I know, but
See a crab cat?
Some thought it could be a huge rat. Now, I'm from New York, and I've seen some huge rats.
Especially under the F train at West 4th Street, huh?
They get big down there, but not this big. Plus, rats have 4 toes on their back feet. Again, this thing had 5. Then another unrecognizable animal appeared. Then another, and another. Plum Island is supposed to be a medical research facility, originally under the purview of the Department of Agriculture. But Plum Island is actually part of Homeland Security. Why? In 2008, an Al-Qaeda operative named Aifa Siddiqui was captured. She was in possession of handwritten notes with possible sites for a mass casualty attack in the United States. One of the sites listed was Plum Island. Again, why? Well, Plum Island research wasn't always about curing diseases. When it opened, Plum Island was about creating them. In 1952, Plum Island was used to research anti-animal biological warfare. Specifically, it focused on weaponizing foot and mouth disease against enemy livestock to disrupt their food supply. But there's evidence that the bioweapons developed on Plum Island weren't only targeting animals, but targeting humans. In January 2010, a human body was found on Plum Island by a local security guard. It was described as a 6-foot-tall black male with no obvious signs of trauma. But there were a few strange details about this man. One is that his fingers were described as abnormally large. Some news agencies reported that his hands seemed mutated. But the scariest detail of all? His skull had 5 holes drilled into it, indicating invasive brain surgery or experimentation. And that's where Plum Island's dark history becomes even darker. Because when the United States wanted to create one of the deadliest germ labs on Earth, it brought in elite personnel to build it. To build Plum Island, the US brought in bioweapon scientists with experience in human experimentation. To build Plum Island, the US brought in the Nazis.
Why couldn't the Montauk Monster be some critter that they were tinkering with that somehow went into the water and got swept by that outgoing tide? Montauk is south and east of Plum Island, not that far, maybe 10 miles as the crow flies, maybe less even. Why couldn't it be that?
Riems Island, Germany is home to the oldest virological institution in the world. Riems was founded in 1910 to research foot and mouth disease. But during World War II, it became ground zero for Hitler's biowarfare program. Riems was run by scientist Erich Traub, who reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, who reported directly to Hitler. Traub experimented with unique forms of biological warfare. He specialized in biting and stinging insects. He discovered that if you infect beetles and ticks with a deadly disease, you can drop them on enemy troops and their food supplies. You can devastate an entire army without firing a single shot. Ticks were considered an ideal weapon for biological warfare. They're small, making them hard to detect. They're resilient, making them hard to kill, and they feed on human blood, making them motivated to spread disease.
The tick is the perfect germ vector, which is why it has long been fancied as a germ weapon by early bio-warriors, from Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan to the Soviet Union and the United States.
After the war, there was no Nazi Germany. There was no Empire of Japan. But the Soviet Union and the United States were still very interested in using poison ticks in warfare, except now they would be used on each other. So now the two allies became enemies, and competition for German technology was fierce. The United States launched Operation Paperclip, a secret program that recruited German scientists, engineers, and technicians. The US gave German scientists a choice: work for us and your war crimes are forgiven. Not a difficult decision for most. Even if German scientists refused to work for the US, they could still find themselves swept up in Operation Osoaviakim. This was the Soviet counterpart to Operation Paperclip, but where the US gave scientists a choice, the Soviets took them by force. Erich Traub was one of the scientists forced to work for the Soviets from his lab on Riems Island. But in 1948, British intelligence got him out and brought him to the States. Soon he was working at Fort Detrick, the Army's biological warfare headquarters. And based on the design of Traub's island in Germany, the United States built their own lab off the coast of New York. So the Plum Island Animal Disease Laboratory opened its doors in 1954.
A source who worked on Plum Island in the 1950s recalls that animal handlers and a scientist released ticks outdoors on the island. They called him the Nazi scientist. In 1951, they were inoculating these ticks.
It would take years before residents in the area would learn what was happening on Plum Island. And when locals found out, tensions were high. Nobody wanted a bioweapons lab in their backyard. Moral issues aside, what if some disease made it to the mainland? After all, about 10 million people live within 100 miles of the island. A lab leak would be catastrophic. But even when the government finally acknowledged the facility, they said that 1, it wasn't researching bioweapons, and 2, there's no way anything could escape the island. But here's the thing, those were both lies.
This animal facility, since 1954, when it was actually inaugurated as a biological warfare facility by Nazi Germany's top warfare officer that we secretly imported to the United States. The goal was germ warfare.
Is that true? It really was a Nazi? A Nazi ran the place? An ex-Nazi?
Yeah, his name was Erich Traub. We can find him in the depths of the National Archives and Record Administration, where I found him.
In 1971, a mysterious virus began decimating Cuba's pig population, threatening a major food source. Within 2 years, over 500,000 pigs had died or been slaughtered. The cause was African swine fever, a highly contagious and usually fatal virus. This was the first and only outbreak of swine fever in the Western Hemisphere. As a result of the epidemic, Cuba was forced to slaughter every pig on the island. How African swine flu got onto the island was a mystery. Well, a mystery to everyone except the Cubans. The Cuban government blamed the United States, specifically the CIA. After all, Operation Mongoose was well known to the Cubans. This was a covert operation initiated by the CIA in the early 1960s. Its primary objective was to remove Fidel Castro from power, and although they were never implemented, biological weapons were a part of this plan. The CIA had planned to spray botulinum toxin on the island. The justification for this is that it would save the lives of thousands of American soldiers. Cuban civilians wouldn't be so lucky. Botulinum toxin is one of the most potent toxins on Earth. Estimates put the casualty count at somewhere between 1% and 2% of the Cuban civilian population. We're talking hundreds of thousands dead. Now, luckily, Operation Mongoose ended and this never came to pass. But when a disease landed on Cuba out of nowhere, all signs pointed to the CIA. 1977, Long Island newspaper Newsday reported 2 Cuban exiles admitted they were part of the plot. They said in early 1971, they were given the virus at Fort Gulick in Panama. They then traveled to Navassa Island near Cuba and smuggled the virus to the island. Now, there is proof that the U.S. Navy was on Navassa Island in early 1971, but they claim this was a scientific mission, though the science they were researching was looking for animal diseases that could jump to humans. Now, that might be a coincidence, but there's only one place in the Western Hemisphere that has live African swine flu. That's Plum Island. And the way African swine flu is transmitted? Through ticks. This was the exact method of biological attack that Eric Traub specialized in. Of course, the CIA denied all of this, and still does, but it has to.
Why does the CIA have to deny this?
Well, this attack happened in 1971. President Richard Nixon ordered all bioweapon research to stop in 1969. So there's no way the CIA could have been involved, right?
Oh, I know where this is going.
But in 1975, a congressional report revealed that the CIA continued to maintain a stockpile of biological weapons, lots of them, in violation of the order.
The CIA doesn't like to follow orders.
No, they don't. And this was a terrifying prospect. Who is in charge of these dangerous bioweapons? With no oversight, there's a high risk that one of these diseases could infect the population and we'd never see it coming. Turns out, that's exactly what happened. In 1975, Ronnie was working a security detail for a warehouse in Connecticut. During his shift, he walked the building, the parking lot, and the fence around the property. During one of his rounds, he felt a pinch on his ankle. He was breaking in a new pair of boots, and he knew he'd spend the next few nights nursing sore feet. When he got home, the first thing he did was strip off those damn boots, and sure enough, he had a small red welt on his ankle. When he woke up the next morning, the small red welt had ballooned into a painful blister shaped like a bullseye. When he rubbed it, he felt a bump. He looked more closely. The bump was a bug, and it was alive. Ronnie grabbed a pair of tweezers, and when he pulled the bug out, it broke apart. A few days later, his joints started to ache and he felt sick. He thought he had caught the flu, but it wasn't the flu. In 1975, the small town of Old Lyme, Connecticut experienced an outbreak of a devastating new disease. Some people got rashes, some ran high fevers, others had painful swollen joints. Some people had all these symptoms, as well as headaches, dizziness, and shortness of breath. In severe cases, people were becoming delusional, experiencing psychosis, and becoming paralyzed. At first, doctors misdiagnosed the condition as a type of arthritis. They named it Lyme arthritis after the town that had the first outbreak. 2 years later, scientists finally connected Lyme arthritis to the bite of a deer tick. A type of single-cell bacteria called Borrelia was to blame for what's now known as Lyme disease. As the reports of symptoms came in, these cases were placed on a map. A disturbing picture started to appear. Ground zero was Plum Island. This was another disease spread by ticks. This also has Eric Traub's fingerprints all over it. But was the outbreak an accident? Or is the government conducting a test on the population without their knowledge? If it was a test, it wouldn't be the first time. In the 1930s, the Tuskegee experiment infected 400 men with syphilis to see how the disease affected black males. They were denied treatment. The US government has infected prisoners with cow blood and exposed people to plutonium.
It really was the Kmart of human experimentation from 1951 to 1974.
Operation Sea Spray was a secret test in 1950 where the government dropped bacteria on the entire city of San Francisco. In 1966, the Army released bacteria into the New York subway to simulate a biological attack.
Hey, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere?
Project 112 and Project Shad infected thousands of military personnel with biological agents like BZ and nerve toxins like sarin gas.
The tests themselves were a lot of smoke. The planes would let out like a smoke or gas type of thing, and it would also cover the ship.
The crew was given gas masks and told not to worry.
They were exposed to toxic nerve gas at least 46 times. Nobody knows how many people were killed. The records are still mostly classified. And there are more, lots more. Tests without consent have been conducted as recently as the 1990s, many involving children. And that's just what's been exposed. Who knows how many more tests are still classified or if tests are still taking place?
We do know that some civilians were exposed in tests that occurred in Hawaii, possibly in Alaska, and possibly in Florida.
The military and intelligence community, of course, continue to deny any wrongdoing. They deny that bioweapon research was done at Plum Island, and they deny that Lyme disease was artificially created and released to the public. But denial is not good enough. We know the CIA and military violate orders time and time again, and we know they lie when they do it. So in 2019, Congressman Christopher Smith from New Jersey proposed an amendment to the 2020 defense bill.
For years, Mr. Speaker, books and articles have been written credibly asserting that significant research at Fort Detrick and Plum Island and elsewhere was conducted to turn ticks into bioweapons. Mr. Speaker, with Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases exploding in the United States, an estimated 300,000 to 427,000 cases, new cases each year, and 10 to 20% of those people with chronic Lyme, Americans have a right to know whether or not any of this is true.
But what prompted this? Well, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease is called Borrelia burgdorferi, after Willy Burgdorfer, who discovered it. Now, Burgdorfer was widely known as a leading researcher in the scientific study of insects, and his discovery of Lyme disease was historic. But what's not widely known about Burgdorfer is that early in his career, he developed biological weapons for the US military. Specifically, he weaponized ticks. And between 1966 and 1969, almost 300,000 research ticks, they got out.
Dr. Willy Burgdorfer, the researcher who was credited with discovering Lyme disease. Turns out that Dr. Burgdorfer was a bioweapons specialist. The interviews, combined with access to Dr. Burgdorfer's files, reveals that he and other bioweapons specialists stuffed ticks with pathogens in a quest to cause disability, disease, and death.
Between 1966 and 1969, government researchers released 300,000 ticks into the wild. The ticks were irradiated so they could be tracked.
300,000 irradiated ticks. What could possibly go wrong?
Oh, plenty. One of the species released were Lone Star ticks. Lone Star ticks are especially aggressive. Most tick species wait for prey by attaching to a blade of grass. When an animal brushes against it, the tick latches on. This is called questing. Lone Star ticks are different. They don't wait. They actively hunt. They can smell the ammonia in sweat and the carbon dioxide from breath. They're the only ticks with eyes.
Unlike other ticks, the Lone Star can bite multiple times. Even their young, called nymphs, can feed on humans. Lone Star ticks can go months without food. They can absorb water from the air. They can survive underwater. They can be frozen. Female Lone Star ticks lay hundreds of thousands of eggs at a time.
And scariest of all, Lone Star ticks swarm. They'll ball themselves up in groups of almost 10,000 ticks. And when an animal or person brushes up against a group, it means thousands of tick bites. And these ticks carry a lot of diseases. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, ehrlichiosis, tularemia, heartland virus, and on and on. A bite from a Lone Star tick can even trigger a delayed allergic reaction to meat.
That tick bite leads to an allergic response to the alpha-gal sugar that's found in red meat.
Ugh, I wish they would invent a tick that gives you an allergic reaction to fish, huh?
Now, forever, the Lone Star tick was confined to the southeast United States, but thousands were released in Virginia in the late 1960s. Since then, they've expanded to the entire eastern half of the United States, from Minnesota to Maine, down to Florida, and all the way across Texas. And they're still moving.
I was called to investigate an outbreak, and I was horrified. I've studied ticks for 10 years, and the number of Lone Star larvae I found was just astonishing. They're everywhere. Every property that we have gone to, we've found Lone Star ticks. They're literally every place. I hope this isn't the new normal, but I fear that they're exploding in numbers.
The CDC says alpha-gal syndrome, traditionally found in mid-Atlantic states, is spreading. 110,000 suspected cases have been identified since 2010, but experts estimate the true number affected is closer to 450,000.
Plum Island boasted how it was considered the safest virus lab in the world. until it wasn't. In 1978, foot and mouth disease did get out. Every animal on the island had to be cremated, but not before lunch.
Wait. Did you just say lunch?
Well, hey, even scientists working at a top-secret government germ lab gotta eat.
On kill day, the guys upstairs would carve up steaks, from sirloins to pork chops. Not USDA grade A, but USDA grade V for virus. Everyone, to a man, would deny it. But we did it. We ate the meat.
Ugh, I don't feel well.
Yeah, not only is it gross to eat meat infected with foot and mouth disease, it's a little irresponsible. Now, FMD isn't dangerous to humans, but this speaks to shoddy conditions at Plum Island. After the foot and mouth breakout, the USDA inspected the facility. They wrote a 190-page report detailing how mismanaged it was. They found leaking roofs, leaking walls, steel beams rusted through. They found an incinerator lying in a ditch half filled with dirty water. And soon after this, there was an outbreak of Rift Valley fever on the island. Weaponized RVF was being tested by infecting mosquitoes. Some mosquitoes got out and bit the scientists. Now, luckily, they knew how to treat it. But if those mosquitoes got off the island and made it to shore, Rift Valley fever presents like the flu, but if you don't treat it, it kills you. In 2002, 76 Plum Island workers went on strike. Scabs were brought in to replace them, and it did not go well. The FBI conducted an investigation and found all kinds of issues. A 600-gallon container of liquid nitrogen somehow fell off one of the island's ferries. Hundreds of gallons of oil and chemicals were spilled all over the island. 2 workers drove off with a minivan and didn't come back. The van was later found, but whatever was in it was gone. And failing to learn from their mistakes, 2 years later, there were 2 more outbreaks of foot and mouth disease on Plum Island. In New Haven, Connecticut, a worker at Yale University's arbovirus lab became infected with Sabia virus. This virus causes extremely high fevers and internal bleeding. So he got infected, went home, and took a trip to Boston. If anyone got sick, that information is not public. More recently, a Fort Detrick researcher accidentally stuck herself with a needle containing Ebola. These breakdowns in security of facilities like Plum Island prompted a nationwide investigation. But a 2007 report revealed that 113 bioweapon-capable labs around the United States refused to comply with inspections. And this is not just a violation of federal law, it's a violation of the Geneva Conventions. But President George W. Bush granted the facilities amnesty from inspections, and Congress agreed.
Wait. The United States can decide when it doesn't want to follow the Geneva Conventions?
No.
But it decides anyway.
Yes.
And other countries don't complain?
Oh, they complain, but...
But if you want those billions of financial aid to keep flowing, shut your yap.
Bingo. Biological weapons were banned in 1925 by the Geneva Protocol, but the United States refused to sign it. It wasn't until Richard Nixon banned bioweapons research that the U.S. agreed to a worldwide ban. The U.S. finally signed the Geneva Protocol in 1975.
Somebody let the CIA know.
These scary events happened in relatively small labs around the country, with maybe a few dozen to a few hundred employees. Can you imagine what would happen if there was a leak at the CDC with 10,000 employees?
Whoa, the CDC had a leak?
A leak? No.
Oh, thank God.
They've had dozens.
Oh, no!
In May 2012, 24-year-old Amy Copeland and a few friends were ziplining near the Tallapoosa River in Georgia. During one of Amy's runs, she heard a snap. The zip line broke and she fell into the creek below. She landed on sharp rocks and cut her leg pretty badly. She went through routine surgery, but over the next 2 days developed a fever and severe pain. Amy was infected with Aeromonas hydrophila, a rare type of flesh-eating bacteria. This bacteria moves faster than antibiotics can work, so the only way to remove it is to remove the limbs it infects, so you have to move fast. Amy survived, but lost both hands, both feet, and her entire left leg. But suddenly, more cases of this rare disease were popping up. Georgia, South Carolina, northern Florida. When looking at these cases on a map, people started asking, how secure is the CDC building in Atlanta? Well, not as secure as you'd hope. In June of 2012, just weeks after Amy Copeland's accident, it was reported that the CDC building in Atlanta had an airflow problem. Rather than drawing clean air into a contaminated lab, it was blowing contaminated air out.
Dirty, germy air?
Yep. In that building, they study SARS, monkeypox, and anthrax.
Oh, the heavy metal band?
The disease.
That makes more sense.
While transporting samples, about 80 employees in Atlanta may have been exposed to live anthrax.
Live anthrax? So you mean like in concert?
Still the disease.
Ah, right.
About a year later, it was found that the CDC was storing anthrax in unlocked refrigerators in unrestricted areas. At least 5 times the CDC improperly handled and shipped deadly pathogens to different labs around the country: anthrax, botulism, and bird flu. About a week after this report, old vials of smallpox were discovered in a building on the Bethesda campus of the National Institutes of Health. And this was after the NIH promised to do better.
Better than what?
Well, about a year before, a deadly bacteria got out, and 12 people died. In 2016, investigations show more CDC safety lapses with storing and handling anthrax and Ebola, from software errors to power outages to sealing doors with duct tape.
Did you just say they use duct tape to keep in deadly viruses?
Yep, and this goes on. And these are just the instances we know about. It's not like the CDC issues a press release every time there's a security failure. Most of these discoveries were made with Freedom of Information requests from citizens. These types of leaks and failures do happen, and they happen more frequently than most people think. These safety problems are at the CDC in Atlanta, one of the most secure facilities on the planet. If a leak can happen there, they can happen in other places.
Yeah, Chinese places.
Well, let's not single out any specific country.
Cheap.
Look, just because that rare flesh-eating bacteria is not so rare anymore, I'm not saying it came from the CDC. And Lyme disease probably wasn't created on Plum Island because there's evidence it existed for a long time. You know Otzi, the 5,000-year-old mummy who was found in the Alps? Well, his DNA showed evidence of Lyme disease. But the outbreak of Lyme disease does coincide with research into weaponizing ticks. And the expansion of Lone Star ticks does coincide with the uncontrolled releases of thousands of them in the late 1960s. Dr. Willy Bergdorfer, before he died, did kind of say that Lyme disease was a research experiment gone wrong. Maybe. He had advanced Parkinson's, so it's really hard to tell what he was saying. But there are people who believe that there's no question about it. Books like Lab 257 by Michael Christopher Carroll and Bitten by Chris Newby lay out a very convincing case. Now, there's plenty of evidence, but evidence isn't proof. And researching this episode was stressful. The idea that the government has tested bioweapons on its citizens is upsetting enough. But what's really scary is how sloppy the security is in our labs. I had no idea it was this bad. And given what's happened over the past couple of years, we need to pay attention. If you have one of these labs near you, get to know your congressman. Demand that lab safety protocols are made public. Demand to know the result of any safety investigations. Now, they're not going to tell you any of that. But if they know we're watching, they'll pay closer attention to safety procedures. We hope. And look, if you're in the New York or Boston area, you can stop worrying about Plum Island. It's scheduled to be closed at the end of this year. But the work currently being performed there will continue. It'll just take place at a new facility in Kansas, in the middle of the country, in the middle of America's food supply. Bon appetit. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. My name is AJ, that's Hecklefish.
Yeah, it's cracking.
This has been the Y-Files. If you had fun or learned anything and you're not too scared to death, do us a favor and like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps us out. And like most topics we cover on the channel, today's was recommended by you. So if there's a story you'd like to see or learn more about, go to theyfiles.com/tips. And if you need more Y-Files in your life, check out our Discord. There's thousands of people on there 24/7. They're weird like us, they're into the same stuff we are, and they tell the craziest stories you'll ever hear. It's free to join, so check it out. And special thanks to our patrons who make all this possible. I dedicate every episode to you, and I can't thank you enough for your generosity. Now, if you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a member on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you get early access to videos without commercials, early access to products like the Hecklefish plushie, special access on Discord, and 2 extra live streams every week just for you. Another great way to support the channel is grab something from the Y-File store.
Grab yourself a Hecklefish coffee mug, and then put on one of these Hecklefish t-shirts, and then grab a Hecklefish talking plushie, stuffed animal talking doll fish toy.
That's gonna do it. Until next time, be safe, be kind, and know that you are appreciated.
And the solar storm still come to Agatha, the secret city underground.